Hey friend, welcome back. I hope wherever you are right now you're comfortable. Maybe you're already tucked in bed, the lights are low and the world outside feels far away. That is exactly the right mood for tonight, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of story that slips into your imagination quietly, like candlelight through a keyhole. So settle in. Here is something nobody tells you about castles. We imagine them as cold, grand, mysterious, full of secrets locked behind heavy stone doors. And yes, all of that is true. But the deepest secret hidden inside every castle and manor house across medieval England and France was not a treasure vault or a dungeon. It was something so quiet, so ordinary that historians almost missed it. It was a room, or sometimes just a corner, a window seat, a low-ceilinged alcove at the end of a corridor that no one really talked about. And it belonged to the women, not the kings, not the lords. The women who for centuries lived in houses full of hundreds of people and somehow carved out tiny invisible kingdoms of their own hidden in plain sight. Tonight, across this entire journey we're taking together, we're going to find every single one of those spaces. We're going to open the doors that history almost forgot to tell us about. Before we go any further, if you are enjoying what I bring to you, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you took just one small moment to hit the like button, leave a little comment or subscribe to the channel. Seriously, even dropping 3 words in the comments like "listening from Chicago" or "this is cozy," that kind of thing makes my entire week. I read every single one. Also, I am honestly curious, where are you watching this right now? In bed, on the couch, maybe on a late drive home? Tell me in the comments. I love knowing where these stories find you. Now dim those lights a little more if you can. Maybe let the fan hum gently in the background, and let us step back all the way back to a world that looked nothing like our own. Imagine the year 1200 and something. It does not matter the exact date. What matters is the feeling. You're standing inside a great hall. It is enormous. The ceiling soars so high above you that the top disappears into shadow even on a bright afternoon. The walls are hung with thick tapestries, not for decoration, but because stone walls in winter will pull the heat right out of your bones, and those heavy woolen hangings are the only thing standing between the family and frostbite. The floor is packed, earth covered in fresh rushes, dried grass, mixed with lavender and rosemary, which sounds charming until you remember that those rushes also collect everything that falls on them. Dropped food, spilled drink, bones tossed aside by the dogs that wander freely through the room. At the far end, on a raised platform called the dais, the Lord and his family eat at the high table. They are higher than everyone else, literally and symbolically. You can see them from everywhere in the room. They can see you. That is the entire point. Below the dais, filling the rest of the hall, are the knights, the stewards, the household staff, the visiting merchants, the chaplain, the squires, the servants. Maybe 40 people, maybe 80. In a great castle, sometimes more than 100. They eat together, they argue, they tell stories. The dogs fight over scraps. The fire in the central hearth spits and crackles. And at night, most of them sleep right there. On benches, on the floor, on pallets of straw pulled out from against the walls. The lord and his lady might have a curtain drawn around the high end of the hall for privacy, a fabric wall between them and 50 other people who can hear every breath they take. This is not a horror story, this was simply life. Privacy as we understand it, that feeling of being completely genuinely alone, did not exist. Not in the way we mean it. The word itself barely had a use yet. There was no room in your house that was only yours, no door you could close and know that on the other side nothing and no one was waiting. And if you were a noblewoman in the 11th or 12th century, this was doubly true. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The noblewoman of medieval England was on paper one of the most privileged human beings alive. She lived in a castle. She wore silk and fur, She ate better than 95% of the population around her. Her husband held land and power. Her children would inherit that power. And yet, she could not walk through a room without someone watching. She could not eat a meal without performing it. She could not have a conversation without it being witnessed and remembered. Her body, her time, her movements, her emotions, all of it was a kind of public property managed and observed by the household around her. Historians who have studied the household accounts and letters of medieval noble families, documents like the Paston Letters from 15th century England, a remarkable collection of real correspondence from a Norfolk family, describe a world in which the lady of the house was almost never alone. She woke surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting who helped her dress. She moved through her day with attendants at her side. She sat at table in full view. She went to the chapel with a retinue. Even going to bed involved ceremony. Now I do not want you to think these women were miserable. Many of them were not. They found deep meaning in their roles, in their faith, in their relationships, in the management of their households, which was genuinely complex and demanding work. Running a medieval estate, overseeing the food stores, the textiles, the education of household children, the management of servants, the care of sick tenants, required intelligence, authority, and nerve. The chatelaine, as she was sometimes called, was essentially the chief executive officer of a very large, very complicated operation. But there is a difference between finding meaning in your life and having space to simply exist in it. And what these women began to do slowly, quietly over the course of centuries is extraordinary. They built rooms, not dramatic rooms, not throne rooms or great towers, small rooms, hidden rooms, rooms tucked at the ends of corridors or above the hall or behind the chapel. Rooms that only they knew how to use because only they understood what was needed there. Now, to really understand what those rooms meant, we have to understand the world they were pushing against. The Great Hall, that enormous communal firelit space, was the engine of medieval social life. It was a stage, and every person in it was performing. Think about that for a second. Every single meal was a performance. Where you sat told everyone in the room exactly what you were worth. If you sat close to the Lord at the high table, you were someone. If you sat near the door, near the draughts and the noise of the screen's passage where servants came and went, you were nobody. The whole physical layout of the hall was a hierarchy made out of architecture, and the Lord and Lady at the centre of it all were performing hardest of all. They could not afford a bad day in the great hall. They could not sit at the high table looking tired or uncertain or sad. They were the apex of the entire social order, and their behaviour set the tone for everyone beneath them. If the lady wept at dinner, the servants would whisper. If she seemed weak, visiting nobles would take note. If she laughed too loudly or spoke too frankly, it would be remembered and repeated. Every gesture, every expression, every word she spoke at that table had political weight. Imagine carrying that every single day. Now imagine after weeks or months of that being able to slip away. Up a private staircase, through a low door, into a small warm room where no one could follow without your permission. That room existed. It had a name. The first of these spaces, the one that historians trace back to the 13th century, though its roots go even deeper, was called the solar. And I want to pause on this word for a moment because there is a wonderful little mystery buried in it. Most people, when they hear solar, think of sunshine. And yes, these rooms were often positioned to catch the best light south-facing with larger windows than anywhere else in the castle. Light was extraordinarily precious in the medieval world. Most of the castle had small narrow windows designed with defence in mind. Arrow slits, thick stone. A solar by contrast often had real windows, sometimes with glass, which in the 13th and 14th centuries was expensive enough to be listed in household inventories alongside silver and furs. But here is the thing the etymologists argue about, and I find this genuinely delightful. The word solar may not come from the Latin word for sun at all. It may come from the Latin word solus, which means alone. Think about that. The room built for privacy in a world that barely understood the concept might have been named from the very beginning after the thing it offered. Alone. The solar was positioned on the upper story of the great house or castle, usually directly above or adjacent to the great hall. You reached it by a private staircase, a narrow winding newel stair that branched off from the dais end of the hall, the high status end, the Lord's end. This was not a servant's staircase. It was a deliberate architectural choice the family could retreat upward without passing through the chaos of the lower hall. And the solar was theirs. Smaller than the hall below, much smaller, because it was not meant for dozens of people. It had a fireplace which made it warmer and more comfortable than almost anywhere else in the building. The walls might be hung with lighter tapestries, the floors covered with rushes mixed with herbs, or if the family was wealthy enough, with a woven carpet, which was an almost unimaginable luxury. There might be cushioned window seats, a chest for storing documents, jewellery, personal letters, a canopied bed at one end. Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, England, one of the best preserved examples of a medieval manor from the late 13th century, still has its solar largely intact. When you stand in that room today, even stripped of its original furnishings, you can feel what it once was. It faces south. The window is wide. On a clear day, the light pours in at an angle that is almost golden, and it is quiet. Even now, with tourists moving through the castle below, the solar feels like a held breath. That is exactly what it was. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because the solar was technically the family's room. The Lord slept there. He conducted private business there. He held small, intimate meetings there, the kind of conversations that could not happen in the full view of the hall. But historians who have studied the social function of these rooms note something telling. The solar's development, its growing importance, its gradual expansion over the 13th and 14th centuries was driven in large part by the women. A note from the 8th book of a medieval household document which scholars have studied extensively describes the lord and lady retreating from the hall, but emphasizes that the need for this retreat was especially felt by the senior women of the household. The solar, that same account suggests, was created as a room for their particular benefit. The women wanted a space to simply be, and they built one. And here is the question that will carry us through the rest of tonight's journey. Was the solar enough? Was one room shared with the husband, attended by servants accessible to the Lord, whenever he chose truly private enough for what women needed? The answer, as you might already suspect, is no, because what happened next is the real story. Over the following centuries, in castles and manor houses across England and France, something remarkable began to unfold. Women began carving out more spaces, smaller spaces, hidden spaces, some of them sanctioned by the social rules of their time, some of them quietly transgressive. The bower behind the solar, the oratory off the corridor, the still room at the back of the house, the wardrobe that held much more than clothing, each one a door, each one a small act of claiming I exist, I think, I feel, and here in this space no one is watching. In just a moment we're going to step inside the first of those truly private rooms, a space so layered with meaning, so quietly revolutionary, that its legacy runs all the way to the books you read and the world you live in today. You know, there is something I kept thinking about after we left the solar behind. We established that women wanted a room. They got one, that south-facing, sun-warmed chamber above the great hall, quiet and firelit and theirs, and for a while that was enough. But here is the thing about humans in general and women in this particular century especially. Once you taste a little space of your own, you do not want less of it. You want more, and so they kept building. The next room on our journey tonight is one that most people have never heard of, and yet it is, I would argue, the most quietly radical space in the entire history of the castle. It was called the Bower. Now, I know what some of you might be picturing. Bower, it sounds almost whimsical. Like something out of a fairy tale, a tangle of roses and ribbons with a woman sitting inside doing nothing in particular. And honestly, that is exactly the image the men of the medieval period wanted to project about it. But let me tell you what was actually happening inside that room. The Bower was a small chamber located just beyond the solar, sometimes directly behind it, sometimes connected by a narrow passage. It was designated as the lady's personal withdrawing space, which in practical terms meant that the lord of the castle could not simply walk in without an invitation. It was hers in a way the solar never fully was. Where the solar was the family's retreat from the hall, the Bower was the woman's retreat from the family. Think about that distinction for a second. In a world with essentially no privacy at all, this was almost unimaginably radical. And what went on in there, officially embroidery, reading, music, prayer, all very proper, all very approved by the social standards of the time. A noblewoman in her bower was a picture of virtue, industrious, modest, occupied with the right kinds of activities. But here is where it gets interesting. Let me put a face to this story. Christine de Pizan. Born in Venice in the year 1364, she moved to France as a child when her father was appointed court astrologer to King Charles V. She was educated genuinely, unusually well, educated partly by her father's encouragement, partly by her access to the Royal Library in Paris. She married at 15, had 3 children, and then her husband died of plague. Suddenly at 25, she was a widow with children to feed and no male protector in a world that had essentially no framework for a woman who needed to earn money. And so Christine de Pizan did something that had never quite been done before. She sat down in a room, her study a small private space not unlike the Bower, and she wrote, not secretly, not apologetically. She wrote poetry first, which charmed the French aristocracy. Then she wrote history, then political philosophy. Then in the year 1405 she completed the work that would echo through the next 6 centuries, a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, a sweeping, brilliant, deeply personal defense of women's intelligence, capability and worth. Now what I find so extraordinary about Christine de Pizan is not just what she wrote, it is where she wrote it from. There is a famous illumination, a painted miniature from around the year 1410 now kept at the British Library in London, that shows Christine sitting in her study. She's in a blue dress and white headdress. She's alone. On her desk are books and papers. Through the window behind her the city hums along without her, and on her face is an expression that I can only describe as absolutely absorbed. She is not performing for anyone. She is not visible to anyone. She is just thinking. That image, more than any text, captures what the bower and the study and the private room meant to the women who used them. The room did not just give them comfort. It gave them the conditions necessary for thought. And in the medieval period, thought was power. Here is something historians have wrestled with for a long time, and I think it is worth sitting with tonight. We tend to look back at medieval noblewomen and see embroidery, and we think, how limited, how passive, how decorative. But scholars who have examined the history of textile work in this period now argue that we've been reading it completely backward. Embroidery in the bower was anything but passive. The most striking evidence of this comes from a woman who lived about 150 years after Christine de Pizan in an era when the bower had evolved, but its function hiding things in plain sight remained exactly the same. Mary, Queen of Scots. When Mary was forced to abdicate her throne and flee Scotland in 1568, she was placed in the custody of George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, and effectively imprisoned in a series of English manor houses and castles for nearly 2 decades. Her letters were monitored. Her visitors were controlled. Her every movement was watched. And so she picked up her needle. Together with her jailer's wife, a remarkable woman named Elizabeth Talbot, known to history as Bess of Hardwicke Mary, spent those years of captivity producing embroidery. Hundreds of panels, animals, flowers, ciphers, symbols. At her death, she left over 300 pieces. Now here is what most people do not know. Those embroideries were not decorative pastimes. They were a private language. In one of the surviving panels, which you can still see today at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, Mary stitched a ginger cat wearing a crown sitting above a small grey mouse. Scholars believe the crowned cat represents Elizabeth I of England. The cowering mouse beneath it is Mary herself. She was embroidering her political situation, her grief, her contempt, her understanding of her own captivity, and hanging it on the wall for anyone to see who knew how to look. Her letters, meanwhile, were being read by agents of Elizabeth's government. But the embroidery, nobody thought to decode the needlework. That is not naivety on the part of her captors. That is centuries of a cultural assumption that women's work in the Bower was decorative, not communicative. Passive, not political, being used against them by the very women it was supposed to constrain. And Mary was not alone in this. A scholar named Pragya Agarwal, in her work on the emotional histories of medieval and early modern women, has described embroidery as women using their needles as pens. She notes that most embroidery pattern books of the period were written and designed by men, which meant that when women deviated from those patterns, when they chose their own symbols, their own colours, their own compositions, they were doing something quietly transgressive. They were authoring themselves, and the Bower was where that authorship happened. Stop for a moment and ask yourself how many other forms of self-expression were available to these women. They could not publish books, not easily. They could not speak in courts of law or in church in any official capacity. They could not hold political office. They were not supposed to write letters to powerful men unless their words were carefully, almost subserviently phrased. Aline la Despencer, Countess of Norfolk, wrote a letter to the Chancellor of England in the year 1273 that scholars describe as a masterclass in persuasion, but she had to wrap her argument in language of such elaborate deference, such careful performance of the obedient wife, that you almost miss the steel underneath. Almost. The Bower then became something that no one had quite planned for a workshop for a kind of coded intelligence. Women learned to say things in the Bower that they could not say anywhere else. Now let me pull back for a moment, because I do not want to make this sound like every woman in every Bower was secretly running a resistance operation with her embroidery hoop. Most of the time, let us be honest, women in the Bower were doing exactly what it looked like they were doing. Sewing, talking, singing, playing music, teaching younger women in the household how to run a manor, how to manage accounts, how to understand the herbs that kept the family fed and healthy through winter, and that too was far more significant than we give it credit for. Because the Bower was the primary site of women's education across several centuries of European history. Think about how education worked in the medieval period. For boys of noble birth, formal education happened at 7 or 8 years old, when they were sent to another household to be trained first as pages, then as squires, then as knights. They went out into the world. For girls, education happened inside the house, and specifically it happened in the Bower. A young girl sent to a noble household as a lady-in-waiting was not just learning to be decorative. She was being taught reading, if the lady of the house was literate. She was being taught music, household accounting, herb knowledge, the management of servants, the etiquette of receiving guests, the management of a pregnancy, everything she would need to run her own establishment one day. And she was learning it from women in a women's space. in a chain of transmission that stretched back through generations. This is why the Bower matters so much. It is easy to look at institutional history universities, courts, guilds, and see women largely absent, and they were from those spaces. But the Bower was its own institution, unofficial, undocumented in the way male institutions were, and for that reason enormously underestimated. There is one more dimension to the Bower that I want to spend a moment on because it changed everything about how I personally think about these rooms. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as manor houses grew more complex, and the demand for private space increased, bowers in the larger establishments began to accumulate something unexpected: books. Not every bower and not every woman. Literacy among medieval noblewomen was uneven. Some could read only religious texts. Some could read and write fluently in multiple languages. Most fell somewhere in between. But the pattern that historians have found looking at household inventories and wills is striking. Books appear in women's personal possessions with remarkable frequency. Prayer books, yes, those were expected. But also romances, poetry, books of medicine, books of household management, and quietly, dangerously works of philosophy and history that their male contemporaries would have considered somewhat beyond the appropriate scope of female interest. Christine de Pizan herself wrote about this directly. In the Book of the City of Ladies, she includes a moment where Lady Rectitude, one of the allegorical figures who appears to her, says something that stopped me cold when I first read it. She says that the arguments men make against women's education have no rational basis, that there is nothing in the nature of women that makes them less capable of learning, that if girls were educated in the same way boys were, they would understand the sciences just as perfectly. This was written in 1405, 620 years ago, from a study, a small private room in Paris. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about the Bower. We celebrate big revolutions. We celebrate the moments when things changed in a way everyone could see, when laws were written, when rights were formally declared, when the world shifted visibly on its axis. But the Bower is evidence of a different kind of change, the kind that happens in small rooms over long years when no one is watching, when women passed books to one another quietly, when they stitched messages into fabric that looked like flowers, when they taught the next generation not in a schoolroom but beside a window with light coming in at an angle, a needle in one hand and a lesson in the other. That kind of change is slower, but it is also, I think, harder to undo. The Bower evolved. It changed names, changed shapes, moved with the centuries from the manor houses of medieval England into the Renaissance and beyond. And as it changed, so did the kinds of secrecy it sheltered. Because the next space on our journey tonight is one where the secrecy went from being cultural to being quite literally a matter of life and death. A room that was supposed to hold nothing more than clothing. A room with a name so mundane that no one questioned what might be kept inside. A room where some of the most dangerous secrets of the 16th century were locked away not behind iron doors but behind the assumption that no one would ever bother to look. Something stayed with me after we left the Bower. We talked about embroidery as a kind of secret language, women using needles as pens, stitching things into fabric that they could not safely say out loud. And I kept turning that image over in my mind because there is a natural question that follows from it. If the Bower was where women hid their thoughts, where did they hide everything else? Their jewels, their letters, their private documents, their money, yes, money, because noblewomen absolutely managed their own finances, sometimes quite substantial ones. Their spices, which in the medieval period were worth more per ounce than most people earned in a week. Their medicines and remedies, the accumulated material evidence of a whole life that was technically, legally, in many cases, the property of their husbands. Where did all of that go? The answer is a room with the most misleading name in the history of architecture. Say the word wardrobe to most people today, and they picture a tall wooden cabinet with a rail inside for hangers. If they are of a certain literary persuasion, they might picture 4 children tumbling through one into a snowy forest, which honestly is a pretty wonderful association, and I am not going to take that away from anyone. But in the medieval period, the wardrobe was not a piece of furniture. It was a room, a small, secure, lockable room, usually positioned just off the bedchamber or sola, and the Oxford English Dictionary, which is about as authoritative a source as the English language, lists its primary meaning in the medieval context as a storeroom for valuables. Not clothing, valuables. The medieval architecture scholar Frank Bottomley described it plainly. The garde-robe, the French word that became wardrobe, was properly not a toilet at all, but rather a small room usually adjoining the chamber, or sola providing safekeeping for valuable clothes and crucially for other possessions of price-cloth jewels, spices, plate and money. That little phrase and money stopped me cold the first time I read it. Let us talk about what money meant in a medieval noblewoman's world for a moment, because I think we dramatically underestimate it. Take Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, who lived through the 13th century. She was the younger sister of King Henry III of England, a woman of royal blood who married Simon de Montfort, one of the most powerful and ultimately most controversial figures in English political history. Her household accounts from the year 1265, preserved in the British Library and extensively studied by modern historians, reveal something remarkable. Eleanor ran a genuinely complex financial operation. Her accounts record expenditure on everything from Italian scarlet cloth purchased for £8, 6 shillings and 8 pence, a colour made from Kermes insects imported from the Mediterranean, impossibly luxurious by the standards of the time, to payments for messengers travelling between her household and her husband in the field during the political crisis that would eventually become the first revolution in English history. She was in effect managing a wartime supply operation from inside her domestic space. And where were the records of all this kept? Where were the jewels that functioned as portable wealth, the spices that were worth their weight in silver, the letters that documented alliances and debts, and arrangements that affected the futures of her children in the wardrobe? Locked, accessible only to those she permitted inside. Now here is what I find genuinely fascinating about the wardrobe as a room, and I want you to lean in a little here, because this is the part that I think rewrites the story most dramatically. In the medieval period, the wardrobe was not just a storage room. For those with power, it evolved into something that functioned as an administrative office. The king had a wardrobe, a department of clerks who kept his private accounts, managed his secret expenditures, and handled the kind of financial business that could not go through official channels. The historian Thomas Frederick Tout, who spent decades studying medieval English government in the early 20th century, described the wardrobe's appeal in terms that apply just as well to its female equivalents. It was valued, he wrote, for its new and elastic nature. It was not bound by the restrictive customs of the official bureaucracy. It could move fast. It could keep secrets. The king used his wardrobe to govern by stealth when the official channels were controlled by his barons, and noblewomen, quietly without anyone particularly noticing, used their wardrobes the same way. Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England, wife to Henry III and mother to the future Edward I, maintained a wardrobe of her own that her biographers have described as having a high degree of autonomy. It kept its own accounts. It managed expenditure on her behalf. It was in the language historians use a department with its own keeper, a queen running a department from a small room that everyone else thought contained her dresses. Pause for a second. Does this not strike you as one of the most quietly brilliant arrangements in history? These women understood something that takes some modern leaders their entire careers to grasp, that real power is often not exercised in the most visible room. It lives in the back room, the small room, the room that nobody thinks is important enough to watch. The Great Hall was the theatre of power, loud and observed and full of performance. The wardrobe was where the actual decisions got made, the actual wealth got managed, the actual leverage got stored. And because everyone assumed the wardrobe was about clothing, because the cultural assumption was that women's domestic space was trivial, it was almost never watched the way the Great Hall was. That invisibility was not an accident. It was infrastructure. Let me give you one more very specific and I think somewhat breathtaking example of what that infrastructure could hold. Eleanor of Provence's ring account. Historians who specialize in medieval royal records have described this document as one of the most fascinating items in the medieval archive, a detailed account of the rings owned and managed by the Queen kept as part of her wardrobe records. And what becomes clear when you read about this account is that the rings were not merely decorative. In the medieval and early modern period, rings were among the most important and portable forms of wealth. They could be given as gifts to seal alliances. They could be pledged as security for loans. They could be used to authenticate letters. A wax seal made with the specific signet ring was the equivalent of a signed and notarized document in our time. Specific rings were associated with specific relationships, specific promises, specific transactions. A woman who controlled her rings controlled a significant part of her political and financial network. And those rings lived in the wardrobe. Now I want to take a slight turn here because there is a dimension to the wardrobe story that goes beyond finance and politics and into something that feels more personal, more intimate. One of the things that medieval architecture scholars note about the wardrobe is its proximity to the body. It was where dressmaking and hairdressing were carried out, not just storage, but active preparation of the woman's appearance for the public world. The lady of the castle came to the wardrobe to be dressed, to have her hair arranged, to have her jewels selected and placed on her. Her ladies-in-waiting attended her here. Her most trusted servants, and in a world where trust was everything, the servants who had access to your private space were among the most carefully chosen people in your life worked here. This was the room where the daily transformation happened, where a woman who had been for a few hours of the night simply herself became again the public figure she was required to be. And something about that liminal quality, that in-betweenness, neither fully private nor fully public, meant that the wardrobe became a kind of confessional space. It was where things were said that could not be said anywhere else. Think about it this way. You're getting dressed. Your ladies are with you. You're momentarily physically vulnerable in a way that the hall never allowed you, are mid-transformation, half-dressed, your hair, unbound, your jewels not yet placed. That vulnerability creates an odd kind of openness, and in that openness things got said. Not all of it political, not all of it world historical, but some of it quietly was. There is something else worth noting about the wardrobe's strange double identity as both a place for valuables and, as the medieval period progressed, increasingly also as the room that housed the garderobe, the toilet. I know. We have to go here because the history is genuinely strange. The word garderobe meant, as we said, a room for robes. But because the toilet was a small chamber built into the wall, often positioned adjacent to the bedchamber or wardrobe, and because people genuinely believed for centuries that the smell produced by the toilet would keep moths away from stored fabric, the toilet and the wardrobe became, in the popular imagination, and sometimes in actual architectural practice, the same word for two very different rooms. Which means that the wardrobe, the word that evolved from garderobe, carries within it this wonderful, slightly absurd history, a room that was simultaneously the most private place in the castle and the most necessary one. A room that held your treasures and provided your most basic needs. A room where your body was tended and your wealth was kept. It was, in a sense, the most honestly human room in the entire building. But here is the thought that I keep returning to whenever I think about the wardrobe as a space in women's history. We have spent centuries imagining the medieval noblewoman, primarily in the great hall, sitting at the high table, perfectly dressed, performing her role as her husband's companion and the household's ornament. That image is not wrong, but it is so dramatically incomplete. The woman at the high table got there from the wardrobe. She came from a locked room where her jewels were kept in chests alongside household accounts and private letters. She came from a room where for perhaps an hour each morning she sat with the women who served her most closely and made decisions that never appeared in any official record. She came from a room that was by the standards of her era entirely hers. The historian who wants to understand medieval noblewomen has to spend less time in the Great Hall and more time wondering what was in those locked chests. Now, and stay with me here because this is the thread that carries us into the next room on our journey tonight. The wardrobe held what a woman owned, but there was another room also tucked in a private corner of the castle that held something even more dangerous. It held what she believed. In the volatile 16th century, when the religion of England changed 4 times in a single generation, when believing the wrong thing could cost you your liberty or your life, noblewomen became some of the most creative architects of hidden space in the history of the British Isles. They built rooms inside walls, they hid priests under floorboards, they kept tiny altars behind locked panels, and they did it all under the noses of a government that was watching every corner of their houses. That story, the story of the oratory and the spaces behind the spaces, is one I have been waiting to tell you since we began tonight. Close your eyes for a second and picture this. It is 5 o'clock in the morning. The year is 1591. Baddesley Clinton, a moated manor house in Warwickshire. Its old stone walls, still cold from the night, sits quiet in the early dark. Inside, a handful of priests have gathered. They are about to say Mass, and then the sound comes, hammering, shouting. Boots on the gravel of the courtyard. The priest hunters have arrived. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the long-tangled history of women and secret spaces, and it begins not with a man but with a woman standing in a doorway. Her name was Anne Vaux. She was 29 years old. She was not a soldier, not a magistrate, not anyone with formal legal power of any kind. She was, by the definitions of her society, simply a woman who had rented a house. And she stood in that doorway, and she did not move. "Do you think it right and proper," she said to the armed men pressing toward her, "that you should be admitted to a widow's house before she or her servants or her children are out of bed? Why this lack of good manners? Why come so early? Why keep coming to my house in this hostile manner?" She was stalling. She was buying time. And somewhere beneath her feet, in a concealed shaft connected to the medieval drains of the house, ankle deep in cold water, completely silent, 5 priests were hiding. The search lasted 4 hours. The priest hunters banged on walls, lifted boards, thrust swords into crevices. They found nothing. Anne Vaux paid them for their trouble and saw them out the door. The 5 priests lived. Now, to understand why this moment matters, why Anne Vaux standing in a doorway at 5 in the morning is one of the defining images of women's hidden power in this entire story, we need to back up about 50 years. Because what happened to Anne Vaux and her sister Eleanor did not come from nowhere. It came from the collision of faith and architecture that reshaped the interior of the English manor house in a way that has never been fully acknowledged. Here is the situation. In the year 1558, Elizabeth I became Queen of England. Within a year, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity passed through Parliament. Every person in England was required to attend Church of England services weekly. Those who refused, known as recusants from the Latin word for to refuse, faced escalating fines. Catholics who harboured priests faced something far worse. By the 1580s, to be a Catholic priest in England was in the eyes of the law an act of high treason. The penalty was hanging, drawing and quartering, the most extreme form of execution English law provided, and yet priests kept coming, smuggled in from the continent, hidden under false identities, a visiting cousin, a household tutor, moving through a secret network of safe houses identified by coded symbols and whispered names. The question was, where inside these houses could a man disappear at 4 minutes' notice? The answer came from a carpenter, and the network that kept that carpenter working, the network that kept those priests alive, was run almost entirely by women. Before we meet Nicholas Owen, because we have to talk about him, he is genuinely one of the most remarkable figures in English history, and almost no one knows his name. Let me tell you something about Catholic women in Tudor England that I find absolutely astonishing. Historically, the law treated women as legal subordinates to their husbands. Their property belonged to their husbands. Their legal standing was largely mediated through their husbands. In most circumstances, this was a profound disadvantage. But in the specific context of religious persecution, this legal invisibility became a kind of shield. A historical study of Catholic recusancy in Elizabethan England notes that recusant wives, widows and daughters were something of a mystery for local authorities because their recusancy was not regulated by law in the same way as it was for men. Husbands were liable for their wives' refusal to attend church, but the enforcement mechanisms were awkward, inconsistent, and often directed at the men of the family rather than the women, which meant that a woman who refused to conform could sometimes operate in a grey zone that her husband could not. Catholic households developed a remarkable strategy around this. The husband would attend church outwardly, conforming sometimes just barely, while the wife managed the household's actual religious life. She organised the secret masses. She kept the vestments hidden. She knew which servants could be trusted and which could not. She maintained contact with the network of other Catholic households, and she managed the physical spaces, the oratory, the hiding places, the concealed altar built into what looked like a simple wooden panel. The phrase historians use for men who publicly conformed while privately remaining Catholic is church papist. But the women who held everything together behind the scenes, who kept the faith alive in the domestic interior, while their husbands navigated the public world, those women have not been given a name that captures what they actually did. I think of them as the architects, because that is essentially what they became, and here is where the physical space becomes so important. In the medieval period, the oratory was a small private chapel or prayer room. Virtually every manor house and castle of any size had one, a dedicated space for prayer, usually positioned off the solar or adjacent to the family bedchamber. It was considered entirely normal, entirely expected. Nobody questioned why a noblewoman wanted a room for prayer, which meant that in the 16th century, as the religious landscape fractured and shifted, the oratory became one of the safest camouflages available. A room designated for prayer was nearly impossible to forbid. If Elizabeth's government had tried to outlaw private oratories outright, the social and religious disruption would have been enormous. So the oratory persisted. It was scrutinized more closely in some cases, tolerated in others. And inside the most carefully designed examples, something extraordinary was happening. Harvington Hall in Worcestershire, a moated Elizabethan manor house that is still standing today, still in something close to its original state, contains one of the most compelling examples. The small chapel at the top of the house, decorated around 1576 with alternating drops of red and white, representing the blood and water from Christ's side, is unmistakably, defiantly Catholic in its imagery. It is a room that declares what its occupants believed in the language of colour and symbol, inside a house that from the outside was doing its best to appear like any other respectable English gentry home. Harvington has 7 surviving priest hides. 7. More than any other house in England. And every one of them was built to protect the priest who came to celebrate Mass in spaces like that small upstairs chapel. Can you imagine what it meant to maintain all of this, to manage the practical logistics of it day after day, year after year, keeping the priest fed, keeping the altar supplies hidden, knowing which rooms had been prepared, knowing which floorboards had been loosened, knowing the exact sequence of steps you would need to take if boots arrived at the gate at dawn. That was not a man's job in these households. That was a woman's job. Specifically, the lady of the house, or in Anne Vaux's case, a woman who had rented the house precisely in order to do this work. Let us talk about Annie Vaux properly, because she deserves far more than a footnote. Born in Northamptonshire in 1562, the daughter of William Vaux, 3rd Baron Vaux of Harrowden and Anne, grew up watching the slow financial destruction of her family. Her father had sheltered the Jesuit missionary Edmund Campion in 1580, a decision that led to imprisonment, ruin, and £20 monthly fines for refusing to attend Protestant services. In modern terms, that fine was equivalent to roughly £4,000 a month. Month after month, year after year. When her father died and her brother Henry was imprisoned, Anne stepped into the space that neither of them could occupy. For the next 20 years, it was her specific vocation to keep Henry Garnet, the superior of the Jesuit mission in England, alive and active. She and her sister Eleanor rented houses. She travelled under an alias, Mistress Perkins, accompanying Garnet as he moved through the country. She managed the finances of the Jesuit operation in England through a system that her contemporaries described as fiendishly complex. She recruited and trained her own network of Catholic women across multiple households, and she employed Nicholas Owen. Nicholas Owen was known to his friends as Little John. He was small in stature, suffered from a hernia that gave him chronic pain, and was one of the most structurally brilliant people of the 16th century. A lay brother of the Jesuits and a carpenter by trade, Owen spent his life creating hiding places so ingenious that the priest hunters who searched them could find nothing even when they suspected everything. He worked at night, typically alone, so that no other person knew the exact location of what he was building. He made hiding places inside chimneys, behind wainscoting, beneath staircases, under privy shafts. He built double hides, a decoy hide that a searcher might find concealing a second, deeper hide that went undiscovered. He built spaces that required the searcher to find not just a hidden door, but to know a specific sequence of movements to open it. At Baddesley Clinton, the hide that saved the 5 priests that October morning was a converted medieval drain. The entrance was through a shaft in the floor of the sacristy, the room where vestments and sacred objects were kept. The priests dropped down through the shaft, down into the medieval sewer beneath the house, and stood there in the dark and the cold water while the search went on above their heads for 4 hours. Nicholas Owen was eventually captured in 1606, taken to the Tower of London, and tortured to death on the rack. He died without revealing a single location, a single name, a single detail of the network he had spent his life building. He was canonized as a saint in 1970. But here is what I want to return to because it is the heart of this part of our story tonight. The priest hole is often told as a story about priests, about fugitive men, cramped spaces, heroic defiance. And it is that. Of course it is that. But it is also a story about women and domestic space, and specifically about the way women used the interior of the house, the private rooms, the domestic spaces that were designated as theirs, that no outsider thought to question too closely, as the infrastructure of an operation that kept a religious tradition alive in England for generations. The oratory was the spiritual centre of all of it. It was the room that justified everything else. The priest could only come to say Mass if there was a room prepared for Mass. The sacred vessels could only be kept if there was a private space where they could be stored safely. The whole operation required at its foundation a domestic space that was under a woman's control and that social convention protected from intrusion. Think of Anne Vaux standing in that doorway at 5 a.m, buying 4 hours with her composure and her indignation, and her absolute refusal to step aside. She was not performing courage in isolation. She was the last line of a carefully designed system, a system of rooms, passages, people, and plans that she had built and maintained over years. The priest holes would have meant nothing without the woman who ran the house around them. There is a detail from that morning at Baddesley Clinton that I cannot get out of my mind, and I want to leave it with you. After the search was finally over, after the priests had climbed out of the drain and dried themselves, after the priest hunters had departed after Anne Vaux had paid them, and watched them leave, Father John Gerard, one of the priests who'd been hiding, wrote an account of what had happened. He noted that Anne had described the searchers as behaving just like a lot of boys playing blind man's buff who in their wild rush bang into tables and chairs and walls, and yet haven't the slightest suspicion that their playfellows are right on top of them and almost touching them. That sentence to me is one of the most revelatory things in this entire history. Not terror, not breathless relief. A kind of dry, almost amused observation about men who could not find what was hidden in plain sight, because they had no idea how the domestic interior worked, because they had never understood the rooms that women built and managed and thought inside. The hide was brilliant. Nicholas Owen was a genius. But the reason it worked, the reason it kept working for years in house after house, was that the people searching those houses simply did not understand the space they were walking through. Women had been building their hidden spaces for 300 years by the time Anne Vaux stood in that doorway. The solar, the bower, the wardrobe, the oratory. Room by room, door by door, they had made themselves a world inside the world, visible to everyone but understood by almost no one. And that world was about to get even richer. Because the next room on our journey is one that did not require a locked door, or a false panel, or any concealment at all. It was a room that smelled of lavender and dried herbs and something slightly sharper underneath. A room that was in the eyes of the law and the church and the household absolutely respectable. A room where women mixed medicines, distilled perfumes, and developed knowledge that made them the most dangerous kind of expert in the medieval world. Dangerous not because they hid anything, but because of what they knew. Walk past a manor house kitchen and you would smell it even before you reached the door. Not bread baking, not roasting meat. Something sharper, drier, more complex than that. The faint sweetness of rosewater, mixed with something medicinal underneath the green sharpness of crushed herbs, the warm ghost of something being gently heated over a small flame, a smell that sat somewhere between a garden and an apothecary's shop, with a little of the perfumer's workroom thrown in for good measure. That smell meant you were close to the still room, and if you had any sense you stopped and paid attention, because the woman working in there almost certainly knew more about the chemistry of the natural world than any man in the house. The still room, sometimes spelled as one word still room, is one of the most overlooked spaces in the entire history of domestic architecture. It gets a single line in most guides to English manor houses, a workroom for household preparations usually near the kitchen. Move along, nothing interesting here. But here is what that single line leaves out. The still room was for several centuries the primary site of scientific investigation available to women in the Western world. Let me say that again, because I want it to land properly. In an era when women could not attend universities, could not be licensed as physicians, could not formally publish scientific work under their own names, in any recognized forum, the still room was where women practiced chemistry, pharmacology, and experimental medicine. Not as amateurs, not as hobbyists, as the primary medical authority for everyone who lived on their estate, and frequently for the wider community around them. The word recipe that we use today for cooking instructions, that word comes directly from still room culture. It is the Latin imperative of the verb to receive or to take. And in the medieval and early modern period, the recipe was not a culinary document. It was a medical prescription. Now, to understand what actually happened in the still room, I want to start with a woman who lived about 500 years before the heyday of the English manor house still room, because she is the intellectual ancestor of everything that went on in those workrooms, and she almost never gets the credit she deserves. Hildegard of Bingen, born in the year 1098 in the Rhineland of what is now Germany, she was the 10th child of a minor noble family. Her parents, following a custom of the time, tithed her to the church as the household's 10th child, a practice that strikes us today as bewildering, but which she, it seems, found entirely agreeable. She entered the monastery at Disibodenberg at 14, eventually became abbess, founded 2 new convents, and then spent the rest of her extremely long life. She died at 81, which was remarkable in the 12th century, writing everything down. And I mean everything: theology, visionary texts, musical compositions, letters to 4 popes and the crowned heads of Europe, a mystery play. She invented her own private language with its own alphabet because apparently she had spare time. She's now recognized as the founder of scientific natural history in the German-speaking world, and in 2012 she was declared a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women in history to hold that title. But what I want to talk about tonight is her book called Physica. Written in the 12th century, Physica is a methodical catalogue of over 200 plants and their medicinal properties organised by the logic of the 4 humours that governed medieval medicine. It is the first book in European history in which a woman systematically discussed plants in relation to their healing effects, not second-hand, not copied from an authority, based on observation, experimentation, and what she gathered from the traditions of folk healing around her. She wrote, for instance, about lavender not just as a sweet-smelling herb, but as a substance that could ease pain, clarify the mind, and she claimed if cooked into wine and drunk warm provide pure knowledge and a clear understanding. Which sounds fanciful by modern standards, but modern researchers studying lavender's anxiolytic properties might give her a second glance. She wrote about betony for troubled sleep, lungwort wine for respiratory problems. She wrote with the authority of someone who had spent decades tending a monastery garden and treating the people who came to her for help. At a time when most women could not read, Hildegard of Bingen corresponded with the most powerful figures in Europe in authoritative Latin, and was respected by the physicians of her time as a genuine peer. She is the template. What connects Hildegard's monastery garden to the English manor house still room 3 and 4 centuries later is a chain of transmission that runs through every household that took its responsibilities seriously. Women passed this knowledge to each other, not through formal institutions, not through guilds or universities or licensed professions, through the still-room book. Here is something I find genuinely beautiful about this, the handwritten household receipt book. The Still Book was one of the most collaborative documents in the history of women's writing. A woman would begin compiling her book before she married, often with recipes passed from her mother and her grandmother. When she married, she added recipes from her mother-in-law's collection, from the women of the new household, from neighbours, from the family physician, when she could get access to his notes from printed herbals, when those became available in the 16th century. Over her lifetime, she would test, modify and improve the recipes she'd gathered. She would add notes in the margins: this works better in summer, use less of the root. This did cure my daughter of the ague in the winter of 1620. When she died, the book went to her daughter or to a trusted relative. The historian Elaine Leong, in her research into early modern English household medicine, describes these books as treasuries for health, personalised compilations of practical knowledge that served as both a medical reference and a record of a family's accumulated experience with illness and healing. She argues persuasively that English homes in the 16th and 17th centuries were vibrant spaces for knowledge production, that the still room, far from being a domestic backwater, was actually functioning as a site of the same kind of empirical investigation that was happening simultaneously and with much more fanfare in the formal scientific institutions from which women were excluded. Let me give you a specific sense of what was actually in these books. One of the surviving receipt books from the mid-17th century, compiled by a gentlewoman named Anne Brummage, opens with the title that says simply, "Her Book of Receipts, or Medicines for Several Sores and Other Infirmities." It is organized alphabetically by ailment. There are remedies for ague, for consumption, for cough. Each one is attributed this remedy came from a neighbour, that one from a physician's notes, another from a woman 2 counties away whose mother had used it successfully for 30 years. What you're looking at is a research network, informal, undocumented in the way that male institutions were documented, but absolutely real and absolutely functional. In another collection, the Arcana Fairfaxiana, compiled by Mary Cholmondeley Fairfax and her husband starting around the year 1627, the medical recipes include instructions for distilled waters, cordials for fever, specific preparations for children's ailments. There are also recipes copied from what appear to be an apothecary's formulary and a physician's notes, suggesting that Mary had somehow gotten access to professional medical knowledge and incorporated it into her household system. These were not dabblers, these were practitioners. Now here is where I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever thought about who was the primary healthcare provider for most of the population of England from roughly the 12th century to the 18th century? Not the physician, the licensed university-trained Latin-quoting physician who charged fees that most families could never afford, and who in any case might bleed you enthusiastically and make you considerably worse. The real primary healthcare provider, the person you sent for when the fever came on in the night, when the child would not breathe, when the elderly relative's wound was going bad, was the Lady of the Manor, a 17th century manual for housewifery by Gervase Markham. A man writing about what he expected from an ideal domestic woman put it directly. The good housewife should have a physical kind of knowledge, how to administer many wholesome receipts or medicines for the good of their healths, as well to prevent the first occasion of sickness, as to take away the effects and evil of the same when it hath made seizure on the body. This was not an optional hobby. It was an expected professional competency, and it lived entirely in the still room. What I find most striking about the still room as a space architecturally historically is what it contained. Not just herbs, not just the standard lavender and rosemary and chamomile of the kitchen garden. The well-equipped still room of a major manor house was essentially a small chemical laboratory. There was still the apparatus that gave the room its name for distilling essential oils, medicinal waters, and what the records call cordial waters, which were essentially therapeutic spirits. There was a brazier or chafing dish for controlled heating, a mortar and pestle, scales, an adjoining stove room with slatted shelves for drying plant material, rows of glass and ceramic vessels containing everything from rose water and violet water to preparations of nightshade, poppy and other plants that required careful handling. The historian describes the still room as part chemistry lab, part compounding pharmacy, part perfumery, part beverage factory. And crucially, it was under the direct authority of the lady of the house. The still room maid worked there, but the recipes and the knowledge and the responsibility were hers. Which brings me to something I have been turning over in my mind since I began researching this story. In the medieval and early modern period, the line between medicine and magic was not where we would draw it today. Knowledge of plants, their effects, their preparation, their dosages occupied a grey zone that could make a woman respected or suspected, trusted or feared depending on who was watching and what the outcome was. The same knowledge that made a woman the healer of her community could, if an outcome was bad or if a neighbour became jealous or an official became suspicious, be reframed as something dangerous. The woman who knew how to ease a difficult labour could in different circumstances be accused of knowing how to cause one. The woman who knew which plant preparations reduced fever could in the wrong context be accused of knowing which ones did the reverse. I want to be careful here not to sensationalize this. The vast majority of women who kept still rooms and receipt books lived their entire lives without anyone questioning their knowledge. They were valued, they were consulted, their books were borrowed and copied and handed down as precious possessions. But the ambiguity was real, and the women who worked in these rooms almost certainly knew it. Knowledge had always been a complicated thing for women to possess. Too much, or the wrong kind, or expressed too publicly, and the balance could shift. That knowledge and the careful management of when and how it was shared is another layer of what made the still room one of the most complex spaces in the history of women's lives. There is one more dimension to the still room that I want to spend a moment on because I think it is the piece that ties this room most directly to everything else we have explored tonight. The still book was a collaborative, multi-generational document, but it was also at its best a kind of autobiography. Not in the way we think of autobiography, not a chronological narrative of a life, but in the way that accumulation tells a story. The recipe copied from a dying grandmother's dictation, the entry for a fever remedy with a note in a different hand that says simply, "This did save my son." The recipe for a cordial that smells of orange flowers and is apparently drunk on high holidays for 3 generations of the same family. The entry marked from the Countess of Kent, meaning someone had gotten their hands on a preparation used by a noblewoman of the highest rank, and was proud enough to record the source. These books accumulated lives, and because they were kept in the still room in a space that was specifically the woman's domain protected by the practical logic of its function, they survived. Many of them survived when letters were burned, when diaries were destroyed, when the official records of a household contained nothing but the names and dates of men. The still books are still there, in the Wellcome Library in London, in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, in county archives across England. Hundreds of them covering roughly 500 years of women's practical knowledge, women's careful observation, women's handwriting pressed into paper across centuries of nights when someone was sick and needed help, and the woman of the house went to the still room and found what she was looking for. There is something I want to say here before we leave this room. We have spent this entire journey looking for the secret spaces that women used, the rooms they carved out the corners, they claim the doors they closed behind them. And what I keep finding is that the most powerful spaces were rarely dramatic. They were not treasure vaults or secret passages or rooms hidden behind false panels. The most powerful spaces were the ones that looked ordinary. The workroom, the prayer room, the dressing room, the laboratory that called itself a kitchen annex. The still room is perhaps the clearest example of all. A room so obviously practical, so obviously domestic, so obviously a place where women were doing exactly what women were supposed to do, taking care of the household, that nobody looked too closely at what was actually happening in there. What was happening was science. What was happening was accumulation of knowledge, testing of hypotheses, collaborative research, medical practice at a level that the community depended on, the careful preservation of expertise across generations in handwritten books that functioned as the first medical libraries accessible to ordinary people. All of it in plain sight. All of it for centuries entirely invisible. That invisibility, that particular quality of power that disguises itself as service, runs through every room we have visited tonight, and it is about to take us somewhere unexpected, because the next space on our journey is one that was not hidden at all. It was in fact one of the most deliberately conspicuous rooms in the entire manor house, and yet the story of what women actually did there, the conversations that happened in it, the alliances formed, the information exchanged, has been sitting in plain view all along, waiting for someone to look at it slightly differently. A room built for show. used by the women who lived in it for something much more interesting. Learned, right. So we have been in the bower. We have been in the wardrobe. We have stood in the oratory at 5 in the morning while priest hunters banged on the gate. We have spent time in the still room among the alembics and the receipt books and the dried bundles of lavender hanging from the rafters. Each of those rooms was either hidden or disguised, or so obviously functional that nobody thought to question it too hard. But the room we are stepping into now was none of those things. It was small, deliberately so. It was positioned at the farthest end of a woman's private apartment, accessible only through her bedchamber, typically locked from the inside, and when you entered it, you encountered what one historian of the period described as a manifestation of the owner's personality and taste books. She had chosen objects she valued, things she was thinking about. It was called the closet, and it was the first room in the history of English domestic architecture where a person, specifically a woman, was genuinely, completely legally alone. I want to spend a moment on the strangeness of that sentence. Genuinely, completely alone. Because we have established throughout this journey that the concept itself barely existed before a certain point. The Great Hall gave you dozens of people at all times. The solar improved things but remained family space. The bower offered more privacy but was still a women's collective room. The wardrobe was attended. The oratory was justified by religion. Even the still room had its maids. The closet, when it emerged in Tudor and early Stuart households, was something categorically different. It was positioned at the end of a series of rooms. Historians use the architectural term enfilade. For this arrangement, a sequence of chambers opening one into the next, and to reach the closet you had to pass through every room that preceded it, which meant that the closet was both physically removed from the public world and socially protected by a series of gatekeepers. Nobody arrived at the closet by accident. Nobody entered without passing through the bedchamber first, and crucially the closet could be locked. Not bolted from the outside by a jailer, but locked from the inside by its occupant. That lock in the context of everything we've been discussing tonight was practically revolutionary. Here is something worth pausing on for a second, and I genuinely want you to think about this one. When was the last time you were completely, truly alone? Not just in a room by yourself, but with the door locked, phone down, nobody expecting you anywhere, no sense of performance or observation or duty. Now imagine that experience, a completely ordinary experience for you, had never happened to any woman in your family's entire history. For the noblewoman of the medieval period, there was essentially no such moment. For the Tudor gentlewoman, the closest thing available was perhaps an hour with the oratory door closed. For the woman of the 17th century, the closet began to change that. Not immediately, not for everyone. But the change was real, and the evidence of what women did with that first true privacy is some of the most extraordinary material in the history of women's writing. Let me introduce you to Lady Anne Clifford. Born at Skipton Castle in Yorkshire in January of 1590, she was the daughter of George Clifford, the 3rd Earl of Cumberland, and a celebrated naval adventurer who had made 11 voyages and served as Queen Elizabeth I's jousting champion at court. Her childhood was one of proximity to power. She was close enough to the old queen that by her own account she was well beloved by her. But when Anne was 15, her father died, and he left his vast northern estates Skipton Castle, Brougham Castle, Brew Castle, Appleby Castle, the title of Baron de Clifford of Westmoreland, and all the lands and income attached to these properties, which had been in the Clifford family for 3 centuries, to his brother Francis, not to Anne, his only surviving child. There was an entail going back to the reign of King Edward II that said the Clifford estates should descend to the eldest heir, whether male or female. Anne's father had simply decided to ignore it. and that decision launched nearly 40 years of legal battle, political confrontation, social pressure, and personal suffering that would have broken most people by the end of the first decade. Anne Clifford did not break. She picked up a pen instead. What makes Anne Clifford's story relevant to our journey tonight is the specific role that the closet played in her survival. At Knowle, the immense house in Kent that became her home when she married Richard Sackville, the 3rd Earl of Dorset, in 1609, Anne's life was by any external measure privileged. Knowle was one of the largest private houses in England. It had more rooms than most small towns. The household numbered over 100 people, and Anne was desperately unhappy. Her husband wanted the money that would come from settling the inheritance dispute. The King James I personally pressured her to accept the cash settlement. The Archbishop of Canterbury pressured her. Her husband's allies pressured her. Richard, growing increasingly frustrated and resentful, cut off her access to their daughter Margaret for a period of time as punishment for her refusal to comply. In a diary entry from the year 1617, after another failed attempt to coerce her, Anne noted that she was living with what she called a discontented heart. Her husband had around this time moved his mistress into the house, and yet. There is a diary entry from October of 1619 that I keep returning to. Anne writes that visitors came to Knowle, that her lord showed them the house and the chambers, and she notes almost in passing, "my closet," but she herself did not stir. She stayed in the closet. While her husband showed visitors around the house she had no legal claim to, while the social performance continued in the room she was expected to inhabit. Anne Clifford sat in her locked room and did not come out. That is not a small act. That is a woman using the architecture of privacy as a form of refusal, what was in the closet. Anne, like many noblewomen of her era and class, used her closet as a reading room, a writing room, and a place for private devotion. She read extensively. Her childhood tutor had been the poet Samuel Daniel, and she grew up understanding literature as something to be pursued seriously. At Knowle she read widely history, theology, poetry. She kept her private accounts in the closet. She wrote her diary there, and that diary is one of the most important documents of 17th century England. I want to be specific about this because I think it is often undersold. Anne Clifford's diary was not simply a personal record of feelings. It was from its inception a legal and historical argument. She intended it partly as a document she could produce in court. She intended it as evidence of her identity as the rightful heir to the Clifford estates, as a person with a specific and documented position in history, as someone whose existence and claim mattered and could be proven in writing. The scholars who have studied the diary carefully, including researchers at the Anne Clifford Project at the University of Huddersfield, note that her autobiographical work came in multiple forms across her long-life diary memoir, and eventually a massive multi-volume chronicle of the entire Clifford family history from the Norman conquest to her own time, supported by the legal documents she and her mother had painstakingly assembled over decades. She built a paper castle document by document in her closet, and she eventually won, not in the courts, those failed her, but by outliving every male heir. When the last of the Clifford males died in 1643, Anne was 53 years old. The estates that had been withheld from her for nearly 40 years finally came to her. She immediately went north and rebuilt them. There is a moment in her story that captures something I find almost unbearably moving, and I want to share it with you. In 1617, at the height of the pressure to settle the lawsuit, Anne was summoned to face King James himself in his private chambers at Whitehall. The king urged her to accept the money. The Archbishop of Canterbury urged her. Her husband urged her. Every powerful person she could imagine was in that room, all pressing her toward the same decision. Anne Clifford, at 27 years old, looked at the King of England and declared that she would never give up her lands under any condition whatsoever. She did not make that declaration in a vacuum. She made it because she'd spent years in her closet reading history, understanding her own legal position, building the argument that sustained her through decades of opposition. The closet had given her the conditions for thought, and thought had given her the steel that made that moment possible. Now, Anne Clifford is an extraordinary example, but she was not the only woman using a closet this way. She is simply the best documented. Historians working on the emergence of private space in Tudor and Stuart England have noted that the closet became in the 17th century a remarkable site of women's writing across a wide social spectrum. Not just legal argument like Anne's, not just receipt books like those we found in the still room, diaries, spiritual meditations, letters, poetry sometimes, short philosophical observations, the beginnings in some cases of what we would eventually recognize as personal essays. One scholar studying the closet as a cultural and literary space has described it as the ancestor not just of the modern study, but of the entire modern tradition of first-person writing. Because the closet was the first room in domestic history where the conditions for genuine interiority existed. You could not write honestly about your inner life in the Great Hall. You could not be truly candid in the solar where others were present. But in the closet behind a locked door, alone for perhaps the first time in your experience, you could find out what you actually thought. There is an irony here worth sitting with. Historians of Tudor and Stuart England have long described the closet as primarily a male space, the Lord's study, the king's inner sanctum, the cabinet where the political deals were made, and yes, the modern political term, cabinet, does literally derive from the small lockable room off a bedchamber where a monarch or nobleman kept his most private documents and consulted his most trusted advisers. But women had their closets too, and the evidence when you look for it suggests that women used their closets in ways that are in some respects more consequential for the long history of literature and selfhood than anything the men were doing in theirs. Because the men in their closets were largely doing things they were already permitted to do in the public world, conducting business, reading law, managing estates, consulting ministers. The closet gave them efficiency and discretion. For women, the closet gave them something they could not get anywhere else: the right to be a subject, not an object of history, the wife, the daughter, the woman through whom property and lineage passed, but a subject, a person with an interior life, a perspective, a record that said, I was here, I thought this, I refused that I survived. Anne Clifford wrote the last entry in her diary on the 21st of March, 1676. She was 86 years old. She died the following day in the room at Brougham Castle where her father had been born. The diary she had kept for over 70 years, from a girl who witnessed the funeral procession of Queen Elizabeth I to an old woman who had rebuilt 5 castles with her own money, survived every change of fortune, every husband, every legal defeat. It is still there. You can read it. That survival is not an accident. It is the result of a woman who understood from the time she was young that writing your own story in a room that could be locked from the inside was one of the most radical acts available to her. The closet changed what women were allowed to know about themselves. But here is what I find most striking as we prepare to leave this room and move deeper into our journey tonight. The closet did not stay small. It grew. It changed shape. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, the woman's closet evolved into the dressing room, which absorbed the social rituals of preparation we first found in the wardrobe. Into the morning room, a sitting room designated for the lady's private hours. Eventually into what the 19th century would call the boudoir, a word with its own extraordinary history. Into the private sitting room. Into the study. Each evolution kept the core of what the closet had been, a room that was hers, that others could not enter without permission, where the work of being herself could happen undisturbed. And there is one more room on our list, a room that sits at the intersection of all the spaces we have visited tonight. A room that contains gardens and herbs and women's knowledge and private thought, and the slow accumulation of power over generations. A room that when you finally understand it makes everything else we have explored tonight fall into place. The boudoir is waiting. There is a sentence I need to start with before we do anything else tonight. The boudoir, from the French verb bouder, meaning to sulk or to pout, was named by a man, probably amused by the idea. The implication was transparent even in its own time here as a little room where the lady goes to be moody. A pouting room, a sulking room. The etymology itself is a kind of smirk, a knowing nod between men about the inexplicable emotional behaviour of women who apparently needed a whole room dedicated to their bad moods. And yet, what actually happened in the boudoir, particularly in the 18th century when this room reached the height of its cultural significance, was something so far from sulking that the word becomes almost a private joke in reverse. The men who named it as a sulkery could not have imagined what was being decided in there. The appointments made, the treaties negotiated, the alliances shifted, the careers ended. The boudoir was in the hands of the women who used it well, one of the most consequential political spaces in Europe. And nobody saw it coming, partly because of the name. Let us take a step back before we arrive at the most famous boudoir in the history of European politics, because I want to establish something about the room itself, its architecture, its atmosphere, its physical reality, that gets lost when we talk about it in the abstract. The boudoir emerged in France in the early 18th century, evolving from the earlier tradition of the cabinet and the closet that we explored in the last chapter. It was typically small historians who have studied surviving examples describe rooms measuring roughly 13 square metres, about the size of a generous modern bathroom. It sat at the end of a suite of apartments connected to the bedchamber, accessible through a single entrance that the woman controlled. Some incorporated hidden locks, some had concealed access from the bedchamber that bypassed the more public rooms entirely. The decoration was deliberate and personal, in a way that no other room in the house was. The Rococo style that dominated aristocratic interiors of the period, all sinuous curves, gilded mouldings, painted panels with pastoral scenes, silk wall hangings in pale greens and rose, found its fullest expression in the boudoir. These were not rooms decorated by committee or by a husband's taste. They were rooms that reflected the personality of their occupant with a precision that the public rooms of the house could never achieve. When an 18th century noblewoman's boudoir was decorated with a particular painting, a specific piece of furniture, a set of books arranged on a shelf, those choices were as legible to an observant visitor as any spoken statement. The room itself communicated. Now, the most famous boudoir in European history did not belong to a queen. It belonged to a woman born Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson in Paris on the 29th of December 1721. Her father was a financial speculator who was forced to flee France in scandal when she was 4 years old. Her mother, left alone with 2 small children, found the support of a wealthy financier who recognized immediately that this little girl was exceptional, sharp, beautiful, talented, and possessed of a quality that is very hard to describe and impossible to manufacture: presence. A fortune-teller told her when she was 9 years old that she would one day be the mistress of the King of France. Her mother apparently took this seriously enough to invest in the very best education available, music, drawing, dance, engraving, acting, and an intellectual curriculum that Voltaire would later say surpassed that of any older woman at Versailles. She was 23 when she met King Louis XV at a masked ball celebrating the wedding of his son. Within months she'd been installed at Versailles in an apartment directly above the king's own rooms, connected by a secret staircase, and within years she was running France. The title history gave her was Marquise de Pompadour. What history took longer to acknowledge was the precise mechanism by which she governed, because the mechanism was the room. Madame de Pompadour's genius, and I use that word carefully with the full weight of its meaning, was spatial. She understood with a clarity that the official ministers of France could not match that power. In an absolute monarchy does not reside primarily in the council chamber or the battlefield. It resides in the conversation before the council, in the private supper where a man reveals what he actually thinks, in the bedroom corridor where the king pauses to mention a name, in the small room where the following morning that name is either confirmed or quietly removed from consideration. The boudoir was where all of that happened. Pompadour prepared the king's business briefings in her rooms. Ministers who wanted anything, appointments, licenses, protection access, learned very quickly that the path to the king ran through her apartment. The Austrians, when they wanted to open diplomatic negotiations with France in 1755 about a revolutionary realignment of European alliances, did not approach the official ministers of foreign affairs. They approached Madame de Pompadour directly. She was the effective Prime Minister of France, operating from a suite of rooms at Versailles that the court referred to with involuntary accuracy as the most important address in Europe. She appointed the Duc de Choiseul, widely regarded as the most able minister France had in the mid-18th century, first as ambassador to Vienna and then as foreign minister. She supported the creation of the École Militaire in Paris, now one of the most recognizable buildings in the city. She backed the first 2 volumes of Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopedia, the project that more than any other single publication was the intellectual engine of the Enlightenment. She moved the royal porcelain manufactory to Sèvres near her own chateau, and visited regularly enough that a new ground colour developed there was named Rose Pompadour, in her honour a rich pink that became synonymous with the decorative arts of the period. She had a printing press in her personal apartments at Versailles. She had a theatre. She had a library of thousands of books at a time when Voltaire, not a man given to easily distributing compliments, said she'd read more than any other woman at the court. Here is the question that genuinely fascinates me about Pompadour, though. She stopped being the king's physical companion in 1750. After that year, Louis XV found other women, and most people expected Pompadour's influence to end immediately the way a dropped torch goes dark. Instead, her power climbed, because the room and everything that happened in the room was never actually about intimacy. It was always about trust, about knowledge, about the particular kind of authority that comes from being the person who understands a difficult, isolated, sometimes melancholic king better than anyone else, who can create the conditions in which he is capable of functioning, who knows which idea to introduce over supper on a Tuesday and which to leave until Thursday. The boudoir was the instrument through which she exercised that authority. And once the authority was established, the nature of the relationship that had created the room became almost irrelevant. Voltaire, who knew her and cared for her and mourned her when she died of what was probably lung cancer at 42, in 1764, wrote with genuine grief, "I am very sad at the death of Madame de Pompadour. I was indebted to her, and I mourn her out of gratitude." He described her as a beautiful woman dying in the midst of a splendid career. A splendid career. From a woman in a room named for sulking. Now I want to pull back from Versailles for a moment and think about what the boudoir was doing across a broader social spectrum, because Pompadour's story, dazzling as it is, can give a misleading impression that the boudoir was only about proximity to absolute power. That is not the whole story. In manor houses across England, in townhouses across the growing cities of the 18th century, as the idea of private space filtered down through the social ranks, the boudoir, or its English equivalent, became something more intimate, and in some ways more interesting a room for correspondence. Letters in the 18th century were the medium through which social life actually operated. Invitations, family negotiations, expressions of feeling, political observations, news from the countryside, market prices, gossip about mutual acquaintances. All of it moved through the postal system in handwritten letters that took days or weeks to arrive and were read, reread, shared, preserved, and sometimes read aloud. The woman who managed her correspondence well managed her social network well, and the boudoir was where correspondence happened. There is an entire genre of 18th century fiction built directly on this reality. The French novelist Choderlos de Laclos, writing in 1782, created his famous novel Les Liaisons Dangereuses, Dangerous Liaison, as an epistolary novel, a story told entirely through letters, and the boudoir appears in it repeatedly as the setting for both the writing and the receiving of correspondence, a space understood by everyone reading the novel as the locus of private intention, where what was actually thought could be expressed, where alliances were made and unmade through the controlled circulation of written words. The novel's most devastating character, the Marquise de Merteuil, is essentially a woman who understands the boudoir's potential for information management and uses it with surgical precision. Laclos meant her as a cautionary figure, but generations of readers have found in her a kind of admiration that the author perhaps did not entirely intend. What I want to draw out here, because I think it is the key insight of this entire room, is the way the boudoir inverted the dynamic we have been tracking throughout our journey tonight. Every other space we have visited was at its core a space that women carved out despite the world around them. The solar, the bower, the oratory, the still room, the closet. All of these were spaces of retreat, of protection, of privacy, claimed against a public world that was organized to deny it. The boudoir at its height was something different. It was not a retreat, it was a stage, but a stage with very carefully controlled seating. The brilliant thing about the boudoir as a political space was that admission was entirely at the woman's discretion. In the public rooms of the palace or the manor house, you could not control who sat near you, who overheard your conversation, who watched your expression. Social ritual governed all of that. In the boudoir, only those you invited entered, and those you invited understood by the mere fact of the invitation that they were trusted, valued inside the circle, which meant they arrived already inclined toward gratitude, toward reciprocity, toward the kind of candour that only flows between people who've been made to feel special. The invitation to the boudoir was itself a form of power. Let me ask you something, because I genuinely want you to sit with this for a moment. We live in an era where the exercise of influence is increasingly public social media press conferences, documented meetings, transparent processes, and we tend to think of that transparency as unambiguously progress. But when you look at the history of the boudoir, what Madame de Pompadour accomplished from 13 square meters of silk-hung room, you start to wonder whether there is something we have lost in the move from private conversation to public performance. The boudoir operated on the principle that the most important decisions are made not in official forums, but in the conversations that precede them. And the women who understood that principle, who built their authority in small, beautiful, carefully controlled spaces rather than demanding a seat at the table they were denied, they sometimes shaped history more profoundly than the men who sat at the table. There is a footnote to the boudoir's history that I cannot leave out because it is both slightly funny and deeply revealing. When the English adopted the word boudoir in the late 18th century, it first appears in English usage around 1777. They needed a translation, and at least one writer, apparently exasperated by the French affectation, proposed rendering it as sulkery. The sulkery. That word never caught on. Thank goodness. But the fact that it was attempted tells you everything about how men outside the French court understood the room as a space for feminine moodiness, not for governance. Meanwhile, at Versailles, Madame de Pompadour was deciding the composition of the French cabinet. The gap between those two realities is, I think, one of the more instructive jokes that history has ever played. And here is where tonight's journey becomes something I did not fully anticipate when I began. We have spent 7 chapters moving through the secret spaces of castles and manor houses, climbing from the solar above the great hall, through the bower and the wardrobe and the oratory down into the still room with its dried herbs and handwritten books, into the locked closet where Anne Clifford wrote her legal argument diary, and now here in the boudoir where Pompadour ran a country. What I notice looking back at that path is that each room is slightly less hidden than the one before it. The solar was almost invisible tucked above the hall. The bower was behind the solar. The oratory was closed to the world. The closet was locked, but the boudoir was visible. It had furniture designed to receive guests. It announced its occupants' taste, intelligence, and social position to everyone who entered. The trajectory is not from one hidden room to another. It is from hiding to presence, from invisibility to a carefully curated visibility. And the next room on our journey is the one where that trajectory reaches its full expression. A room not tucked away at all, but built with deliberate grandeur, visible from the exterior of the house, designed to impress. A room that women transformed quietly over generations from a space of decorative display into something that more closely resembled a laboratory. Not for herbs this time, for power of a different kind. If you've ever stood in a very old house, the kind where the floorboards creak differently in certain rooms, and the walls feel slightly too thick, and had the strange quiet sensation that the building itself knows things, it is not telling you, then you're already halfway to understanding what this part of our journey is about. The spaces we have explored tonight have been rooms closed, defined, named. The solar, the bower, the oratory, the still room, the boudoir. Each one a container for a kind of life that the public world was not supposed to see. But there is another category entirely. Not rooms, not even spaces you could stand in and turn around. Holes. Small calculated holes cut into the fabric of buildings, positioned with geometric precision, designed to give one person a view or a sound that nobody else in that building knew about. And the women who lived in those houses knew exactly where those holes were. I want to start with Scotland because Scotland did the most wonderfully unapologetic job of naming what these architectural features actually were. The Laird's Lug. In Scots, lug means ear, the Laird's ear. A small hidden chamber or opening built into the wall of a castle adjacent to the great hall, accessible from the Laird's private apartment above, through which the occupant could hear and sometimes see everything that was said in the hall below. It sounds like something out of a spy thriller, but these were real, they are documented, and several of them still exist today. Edinburgh Castle has one. It is a small barred window set high above the great hall fireplace, which allowed King James IV to eavesdrop on his subjects gathered below. It was so effective that in 1984, when the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was due to visit the castle, the Soviet security services demanded it be bricked up before his arrival. The Soviets, trained in the arts of surveillance, recognized a listening device when they saw one, even one built 400 years earlier. Castle Fraser in Aberdeenshire has one dating from the period between 1575 and 1618, measuring roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, accessible through a trapdoor barely a foot square. Muchal's Castle has one built directly into the chimney of the Great Hall. MacLelland's Castle in Kirkcudbright has a surviving example cut into the back of the Great Hall fireplace itself. The Scots were, as someone once put it quite accurately, 4 centuries ahead of electronic eavesdropping. Now, and here is the question I want you to sit with for a moment. Who do you think actually used these things? The traditional assumption is that the Laird built them and the Laird used them. And yes, that is true in some cases. But think about the daily reality of who managed the household. Think about everything we have established in the rooms we've already visited tonight. Think about who knew which servants could be trusted, who understood the social landscape of the house, who needed to know what was being said in the great hall when the Lord was away at court. The laird's lug was a tool, and the women who ran these households were not above using the tools available to them. I cannot give you a named woman standing at the laird's lug at Castle Fraser, her ear pressed to the stone in the 15th century, listening to what the factor was saying about the estate accounts. That specific record does not exist, but the broader historical record is clear. The management of information within the household was a primary responsibility of the chatelaine, the lady of the house. She needed to know what was happening. She had every practical reason to use whatever architecture the house provided to gather that information. The laird's lug was the original smart home system, and in a household run by a competent woman it was one of the tools in her arsenal. But let us zoom out from Scotland and look at something more widespread, because the spy hole and the squint and the listening aperture were not exclusively Scottish phenomena. They appear in various forms throughout the castles and manor houses of medieval and early modern Europe, and they serve different functions in different contexts. In Great Britain, the architectural feature called a squint, found most commonly in churches where it allowed side chapels to have a sightline to the high altar, also appeared in domestic buildings. The historian describing the Great Hall at Stokesay Castle in Shropshire notes that there are 2 squint openings connecting the hall and the great chamber, small oblique holes cut through the wall at seated eye level, through which someone in the private rooms could observe the hall without being visible themselves. Stokesay, the same castle we visited in the first chapter of tonight's journey when we were talking about the solar and the first private rooms women carved out for themselves. The castle where you can still feel standing in the south-facing solar with light coming through the window what it must have meant to retreat from the hall below. Now imagine standing in that same solar and knowing through a small deliberate hole in the wall exactly what was happening in the hall you had just retreated from. The retirement was never entirely complete. The information never stopped flowing. Speke Hall in Liverpool, a timber-framed Tudor manor house that has barely changed since 1598 and is now one of the most intact Tudor domestic buildings in England, takes this to a particularly sophisticated level. The Norris family who built Speke Hall over most of the 16th century were devout Catholics navigating the terrifying landscape of Elizabethan religious persecution. We've already met this world in the chapter on the oratory and the priest holes, but Speke Hall went beyond a hidden room for the priest. It built surveillance directly into the architecture of the house. There is a spy hole in a bedroom wall overlooking what was then the approach to the house, so that an occupant could see visitors arriving long before they reached the front door, giving the household time to hide a priest remove sacred objects or simply compose their expressions into something appropriate before opening the gate. And then there is the feature that the National Trust, which now manages Speke Hall, describes as an eavesdropper, a small hole under the eaves of the house near the front door through which servants could listen to the conversations of visitors waiting outside to determine before admitting them whether they were friend or foe. Think about that for a moment. The house had a system. A visitor arrives and waits at the door. Before they are admitted, a servant has already listened to them talking, reported upstairs, and the household has made a decision. By the time the door opens, the family knows whether this is a friendly caller or someone who might ask dangerous questions about what was heard at Mass the previous Sunday. The whole architecture of the house was oriented around information gathering. And who do you think coordinated that system? Who briefed the servants about what to listen for? Who received their reports? Who made the decision about how to respond to the lady of the house? Here is something I've been thinking about throughout this entire journey, and I want to share it now because I think it reframes everything we have been exploring. We tend to think of information as a modern currency. We talk about data, about surveillance, about the information economy. We think these are new ideas born in the digital age, but the women who lived in these castles and manor houses had understood the power of controlled information for centuries. They understood it not in abstract terms, but in the most practical, immediate life or death terms possible. What was being said in the hall about the estate? Was the steward reliable? What did the visiting merchant think about the price of wool? What were the neighbours saying about the family at church? In the world of the manor house, information was survival. Marriages depended on reputation. Political allegiances shifted on the basis of rumours. Financial negotiations required advanced knowledge of the other party's position. The lady of the house who knew what was being said in the hall, in the kitchen, at the gate on the road, was the lady of the house who could act effectively in the interests of her family. The spy hole was not a curiosity. It was infrastructure. Now I want to make a slightly unexpected turn here because there is a related piece of architectural history that I think belongs in this chapter and almost never gets talked about: the servants' corridor. In the great houses of the 18th and 19th centuries, and to some extent earlier, there was a network of hidden passageways designed specifically for the movement of servants. These corridors ran behind the main rooms of the house. They had doors that looked like panelling from the outside. They allowed the household staff to carry coal-empty chamber pots, deliver food, change candles, and perform the 100 small tasks of domestic management without being seen by the family or their guests. These passages were quite deliberately invisible. The wealthy classes of this period had developed a new aesthetic of domestic life, in which servants did not exist when they were not needed. They appeared, they served, they vanished. The magic of a well-run house was that it seemed to run itself. But here is the thing about those passages. They worked in both directions. A servant moving through a hidden corridor behind the drawing-room walls could hear every word spoken in that room. A housemaid servicing a bedroom she was supposed to have been in and out of in 3 minutes if she moved quietly, if she paused at certain points, could hear the conversation in the dressing room next door. The woman of the house knew this. The best-run households of this period operated on an understanding between the mistress and her senior servants, particularly the housekeeper, that involved a very careful management of who knew what. The housekeeper in a great Victorian or Georgian country house was a figure of remarkable authority. She had access to every part of the building. She knew every room. She knew the rhythm of every household member's day. She knew which conversations happened in which rooms and which walls were thinner than they looked. She reported to the mistress of the house. The passage behind the wall was not just for coal and chamber pots. It was a new service. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Does this feel uncomfortable? The idea of women and the people who served them gathering information through architectural features that others did not know about. I ask because I notice something in myself when I research this, a slight unease, as if there is something not quite proper about it. And then I step back and think about the world these women lived in, a world where they could not own property in their own names in most circumstances, where their opinions had no formal weight in any official process, where their bodies, their children, and their households were legally in most European countries until the 19th century the property of their husbands, where the only leverage available to them was really knowing what was happening around them. The spy hole, the eavesdropper, the servants' network, the strategic use of architectural features that gave visibility without vulnerability, these were not violations of a level playing field. They were responses to a field that was never level. When you see it that way, the laird's lug becomes something else, not a device for surveillance from a position of power, a device for survival from a position of necessary intelligence. The women of these houses were not spying, they were managing. Let me end this chapter with something I find quietly magnificent. Broughton Castle in Oxfordshire, a medieval manor house that has been lived in by the same family for over 600 years, and is one of the most beautiful buildings in England, has a reputation among historians as a centre of political plotting in the years leading up to the English Civil War in the 1640s. Lord Say and Seal, who owned it then, was one of the leading opponents of King Charles I, and the house was, according to contemporary accounts, a meeting place for the men who were planning the resistance that would eventually become the parliamentary cause. Those meetings happened in secret rooms, in hidden spaces, in the rooms of the castle that the family controlled and the outside world did not know about. And the woman who managed the household, who decided which servants worked, which corridors, who knew which rooms had what acoustics, who understood the architecture of her own house better than anyone, was Lady Say and Seal. She was the one who made the house safe for those meetings. She was the one who ensured that nothing said in those rooms reached the wrong ears. She did not attend the meetings. She made them possible. That distinction between the public record and the private infrastructure is, I think, the deepest thread running through everything we have explored tonight. The rooms that changed history were often not the rooms where the decisions were announced. They were the rooms behind the rooms, the spaces between the walls, the holes in the stone through which an alert and intelligent person watched, listened, and understood. And now we've arrived somewhere I did not expect when we began this journey. We've moved from small hidden rooms to the information systems that ran through entire buildings. We've traced a kind of power that operated not by declaration but by knowledge, not by force but by understanding of the space who was in it, what they were saying, what they were not saying, and what any of it meant for the people who depended on the house and everyone in it. The next room we are visiting is one where that knowledge was put to work not through listening but through growing, through the patient cultivation of something living. A garden that was never just a garden, a space that women spent generations transforming from a pleasant backdrop into something that held more authority than any room inside the house. Come outside with me. Step outside with me for a moment. The night air is cool. The last light of the day is just fading over the tree line, and ahead of you, stretching away from the south face of the manor house, is something so beautiful and so carefully constructed that it takes your breath away without you quite understanding why. A garden, but not a garden the way we use that word today, not a loose collection of flower beds and a bit of lawn. This is a garden designed with the precision of a legal document, geometric, walled, divided into compartments, each with its purpose and its meaning. The knot garden near the house with its interwoven hedges of box and thrift forming patterns that from above resemble the knotwork in a piece of embroidery. The herb beds beyond laid out in careful rows. The orchard further still, its paths straight as arrows, its trees espaliered flat against the warm stone of the enclosing wall. Every inch of it has been thought about. Every inch of it means something. And the woman who designed it, who chose every plant in it, who understood exactly what it communicated to every person who visited, she is standing at a window of the house right now, watching you look at it. Here is something that does not get enough attention in the history of women and space. The garden was for many centuries the outdoor room. Inside the house, as we have established, the rooms women inhabited were organized by the architecture of the building, adjacent to the hall behind the solar off the main corridor. Their position in the spatial hierarchy reflected their position in the social one. But outside was different. Outside the garden was almost entirely the domain of the women of the household, particularly the areas closest to the house, the enclosed gardens, the walled gardens, the kitchen garden, and the herb garden and the physic garden. The men of the family might commission a garden as a statement of wealth, and status might show it off to visiting dignitaries, might stroll through the pleasure grounds on a summer evening. But the day-to-day knowledge of the garden, what was planted where, what was harvesting, what was diseased, what would yield medicines and what would yield food and what would need to be renewed the following spring, that knowledge lived with the women. A garden in the medieval and Tudor period was never just a garden. It was a kitchen. It was a pharmacy. It was a source of income, of provision, of beauty. And this is the part that gets left out of authority. Let me trace the development of this for a moment, because it is a richer story than you might expect. The medieval garden attached to a great house typically consisted of several distinct areas. The kitchen garden was exactly what it sounds like: cabbages, peas, leeks, onions, the practical vegetables that fed the household through winter. The herb garden provided the medicinal plants we encountered in the still room: the lavender, the rosemary, the betony, the verbena, the dozens of plants whose properties the lady of the house had in her receipt book and in her head. The physic garden was a more specialized medical resource, often containing plants that required careful management, because their effects were powerful and their dosages critical. Then there was the pleasure garden. This is where things get interesting. The pleasure garden, the enclosed garden with its turf seats and arbours and flower beds, its sundial and sometimes its fountain, was a space specifically for leisure, for sitting, for walking in contemplation, for having conversations that the noise and observation of the house made impossible. Sound familiar? The pleasure garden was in many respects the outdoor version of the bower. It was a space where a woman could be present in the world without being fully visible to it. The walls enclosed her. The arbour covered her. The sound of water from a small fountain softened the acoustic signature of any conversation she might be having with a trusted companion. The garden was not escape. It was extension. An extension of the private interior into the open air, governed by the same logic that governed all the spaces we visited tonight: controlled access, managed visibility, the possibility of being somewhere without being entirely observed. Now, I want to spend some time with the most extraordinary garden story in Elizabethan history, because it involves someone we have already briefly met, and because it reveals something about the relationship between garden and power that I find genuinely astonishing. Bess of Hardwicke. We have touched on her already, the woman who worked alongside Mary, Queen of Scots, on the embroideries at Chatsworth, who survived 4 marriages and accumulated a fortune that made her the second richest woman in England after the Queen herself. The woman who built Hardwicke Hall. When Bess died in 1608 at the extraordinary age of approximately 87, she left behind not just a house, but an entire landscape. And the crown of that landscape, sitting on the hilltop at Hardwicke in Derbyshire, was designed to do something that had rarely been done so nakedly before in English domestic architecture. It was designed to be seen. Every house we have discussed so far in this journey has been in some sense about concealment. The hidden room, the locked closet, the walled garden, the private staircase. Hardwicke Hall went in precisely the opposite direction. The house is enormous. Its windows, vast panels of leaded glass at a time when glass was a luxury item, cover more surface area than the stone walls themselves. The saying coined by her contemporaries, still quoted today, captures it exactly: Hardwicke Hall more glass than wall. And on the roofline, in stone lettering large enough to read from the road below, Bess had her own initials cut: E.S. Elizabeth Shrewsbury. On every tower, on every turret, her name written in stone across the skyline of Derbyshire. This was not modesty. This was not concealment. This was a 70-something widow standing on the estate where she'd been born into minor gentry, announcing in the most permanent materials available to her that she had won. And the garden around that house, the walled enclosures, the formal gardens, the orchards visible from the road, was part of the same statement. Not a hidden space, a declaration. Let me tell you something about garden design as political communication that changed how I understood this entire period of history. In Tudor and Elizabethan England, the formal garden, the not garden in particular, was understood by everyone who saw it as a statement about the character and authority of its owner. This was not a metaphor. this was explicitly articulated in the literature of the period. By using geometry to create a regular layout, the owner demonstrated the ability to shape and control nature. And the ability to control nature implied was used as a direct symbol of the ability to govern, the ability to rule, the ability to impose order on the world. Kings made gardens for this reason. Henry VIII's Hampton Court gardens, with their heraldic beasts on poles painted in the Tudor green and white, were political propaganda in topsoil. The garden said, "This is a man who controls the world around him. This man should be king." And when Bess of Hardwicke made her garden, when Elizabethan noblewomen across England designed their knot gardens and their walled enclosures, they were operating in exactly the same symbolic register. The garden said, "This is a woman who controls the land around her. This woman has authority." For a woman who could not sit in Parliament, who could not hold an official position, who could not speak in a court of law, except through elaborate legal mechanisms, the garden was one of the few spaces where that kind of authority could be expressed in a form that everyone would understand. Have you ever thought about your garden quite that way? Because once you know this, it is very difficult to look at any formally designed garden in any English country house and not see it as a statement. There is a practical dimension to this that is worth dwelling on for a moment. In 1617, a man named William Lawson published a book called The Country Housewife's Garden. It was the first gardening manual in the English language aimed specifically at women. What Lawson describes is revealing. He urges the mistress of the household to maintain two separate gardens, a productive garden for vegetables and herbs, and an ornamental garden, a pleasure garden kept separately and to a higher standard of design. He even includes the latest knot garden designs, assuming his female audience will want to implement them. The fact that Lawson felt this book needed to be written tells you something important. By the early 17th century, the assumption was firmly established that the garden was the woman's space. Not just the kitchen garden, the whole thing. The pleasure garden, the knot garden, the ornamental structures. This was not new. It was the formalization of something that had been true in practice for a very long time. The noblewoman's authority in the garden predates any written manual by centuries. It predates Hardwicke Hall. It goes back to the medieval enclosed gardens of the early manor houses, where the lady of the house decided what was planted and when it was harvested, and how it was used. What changed in the Elizabethan and early Stuart period was that this authority became visible, public, legible to the wider world as a form of power rather than a domestic responsibility. And here is where I want to make a connection that I think ties together more of tonight's journey than might seem obvious at first. The garden was not just a statement of authority, it was a meeting place. Consider the mechanics of it. Inside the house, a conversation in the solar or the hall was potentially overheard. Inside the boudoir, a meeting was private but visible. Everyone who saw a visitor enter the woman's apartment knew something significant was happening. In the garden, the logistics were different. Two women walking in the garden were doing exactly what women were supposed to do. Walking, taking the air. Perhaps discussing the progress of the rosemary or the condition of the pleach d'Alais. Nobody could hear them. The garden sounds birds' water wind through the leaves provided natural cover, and the geometry of the garden, its walled compartments and its covered walkways, meant that there were always spaces where two people could speak without being observed. Many of the significant political conversations among Elizabethan women happened in gardens. We know, for instance, that when Elizabeth I visited the estates of her nobles on her famous progresses, those extended royal tours that were part strategic relationship management, part colossal expense for whoever was hosting the gardens, were central to the entertainment. Robert Dudley built or refurbished the garden at Kenilworth Castle, specifically for Elizabeth's visit in 1575, creating a marble fountain, and a water pageant of extraordinary ingenuity. But the formal entertainments were only part of what happened. The private conversations that shaped policy, the informal negotiations, the moments when a woman close to the Queen could speak without the whole court listening, those happened in the garden. The garden was a room, with walls and a ceiling made of the world itself. And like all the other rooms we visited tonight, its real function was never entirely what it looked like from the outside. Let me end this chapter with an image I cannot get out of my mind. At Hardwick Hall today, you can still walk the garden that Bess designed. The formal enclosures are not exactly as she left them. Gardens are living things and they change, but the structure is there. The walls, the terraces, the herb garden, the orchard, and somewhere in the surviving archives is an account of Bess in old age, still at Hardwick, still managing her vast estate, still in correspondence with everyone who mattered in Elizabethan England. A woman who had been born into relative obscurity, who had navigated 4 marriages and the custody of a queen, and the hostility of a king, and the financial ruin of husbands who spent her money, and the decades of patience required to build something lasting, still here, still present, still paying attention. The garden around her house carried her initials on the walls. The accounts of her estate kept in meticulous order, recorded every plant, every harvest, every transaction. The rooms of the house above her held the embroideries. She had made many of them in collaboration with Mary Queen of Scots, stitched in the private space of a room in the language that needles speak. Every space we've explored tonight was present in that woman's life. The private room, the working room, the space of faith, the space of knowledge, the locked closet, the outdoor declaration. What strikes me most is that she used all of them, not one or the other. All of them simultaneously, each for its purpose, none of them wasted. And there is one more space we've not yet visited, the one that in some ways contains all the others, the nursery, the room where children grew up, where the next generation was shaped before the world knew they existed, where the women who managed everything else we have discussed tonight also managed the one thing that would outlast all of them, the minds and values of the people who would inherit their world. That room is waiting. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of tonight's journey, the very beginning of any life. The earliest, most helpless, most formative hours and weeks and years of a human being's existence. Because what I want to explore now is not a room that women inhabited for themselves. It is a room where they shaped everyone else, the nursery. Here is something I have been sitting with for most of this journey, and I want to say it plainly before we go any further. Every room we have visited tonight, the solar, the bower, the wardrobe, the oratory, the still room, the closet, the boudoir, the garden, every single one of them was in some sense about claiming space, about the slow, quiet work of carving out territory inside a world that was organized structurally and legally to deny it. The nursery did not work that way. The nursery was the one room in the entire castle or manor house that no one needed to hide or argue for or justify. It was expected. It was necessary. And it was in virtually every great household from the earliest medieval period onward, entirely under the authority of women. Not because women were relegated there, because the nursery was where the future was made, and the people who ran those rooms understood that with extraordinary clarity. Let me give you the physical reality of this before we go anywhere else. In a medieval noble household, the nursery was typically located on the upper floors of the house, away from the noise of the great hall and the draughts of the lower rooms. It was designed for comfort rather than display, warmer than most rooms, better supplied with firewood equipped with a cradle, a rocking chair or two, and the particular furniture of infant life. A royal nursery might have a separate chamber for the wet nurses, a rocking room where the cradles were kept, and an outer room for the senior attendants. The population of the nursery was almost exclusively female. A prince's nursery, as recorded in household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, might include 2 nurses, 4 cradle rockers, 1 or more chambermaids, a laundress, and the governess who oversaw them all. As the child grew beyond infancy, a mistress or governess managed the entire operation, coordinating the child's education, manners, religious instruction, and daily routine. The lord of the house almost never entered the nursery. The king barely saw his infant children except on formal occasions, but the governess was there every day, and the women she led were there every day, and the child growing up in that environment absorbed from its earliest consciousness the world that these women created. That is not a passive thing, that is an act of formation. Think about what children actually absorbed in the nursery. Language. The first words any person ever learns come from the people who surround them in infancy. In noble households, this was not usually the mother or the father, it was the wet nurse, the rocker who sang at the cradle. The language patterns, the rhythms of speech, the songs and prayers and nursery sayings that formed the interior landscape of a child's earliest mind, those came from women in the nursery. Not all of them were women of the nobility. Wet nurses in particular were often women of lower birth employed specifically for their milk and their temperament, which means that what these women transmitted was not just the vocabulary of the ruling class, but a more complex mixture, the formal expectations of noble life blended with the older earthier knowledge of women who had grown up close to the land. Medieval writers were acutely aware of this. There was a widespread belief that breast milk itself carried character traits, that a child absorbed not just nourishment, but something of the moral and psychological character of the woman who fed them. A 13th century medical text by Aldobrandino of Siena explicitly advises parents to choose a wet nurse with great care, examining not just her health, but her habits, moral fortitude, and temperament. Because the child would absorb these qualities along with the milk. Whether or not you believe the physiology, the logic is sound. Children do absorb the character of those who care for them. The nursery was from this perspective not just a room for feeding and sleeping. It was an environment for the construction of a human being, and women ran it entirely. Here is where I want to introduce someone whose influence on English history is so vast, so fundamental, and so little acknowledged that I almost do not know where to begin. Margaret Beaufort, born on the 31st of May, 1443, daughter of John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset and great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, a woman who was widowed at 13, already carrying the child who would become the first Tudor King of England. A woman who gave birth to Henry Tudor at Pembroke Castle in Wales in January of 1457, alone, except for her brother-in-law Jasper, in one of the most difficult labours of the era, an experience so physically damaging that she never conceived again. And yet, the story of how Margaret Beaufort spent the next 30 years working in the shadows of the Wars of the Roses with no official power and no formal title, to place her son on the throne of England, that story has been told. The secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the influence over her husband's critical decision at Bosworth Field, the network of correspondence carried in secret, the decades of careful preparation, historians have begun to do justice to it. What gets less attention is what happened after Henry VII became king. Because what Margaret Beaufort did with the access and authority that victory gave her was go directly to the nursery. During the reign of her son, Lady Margaret was referred to at court by the title, My Lady the King's Mother. She signed herself from 1499 onward as Margaret R, and historians have debated what that R meant. Richmond the region associated with her second husband, or Regina, the Latin word for queen. Given everything else we know about Margaret Beaufort, the ambiguity seems almost deliberate. She dominated her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York with a firmness that contemporaries noticed and recorded. She took charge of the royal nurseries where her grandchildren were raised. She arranged the education of those grandchildren with the attention to detail of someone who understood with absolute clarity that the person shaped in the nursery would one day sit on the throne. Her grandson Henry, the future Henry VIII, was said to have chosen the members of his Privy Council in the very first weeks of his reign on the basis of his grandmother's suggestions. He was 18 years old, she was 65 and dying, and she still had his ear. When she died on the 29th of June 1509, the day after Henry VIII's 18th birthday, 5 days after his coronation, she had outlived her son by just 2 months. She had placed a Tudor on the throne and shaped the values of the next one. All of it grounded in the nursery. All of it built on the kind of authority that begins not with a sword or a charter, but with a child's first years of understanding. Now I want to step back from the grand historical narrative for a moment because I think it is easy to focus only on the famous women and the royal nurseries and miss the broader pattern. The nursery in manor houses across England and France was an institution. Not a formal institution, it was never chartered or officially recognised the way a university or a guild was, but it functioned with its own hierarchy, its own professional standards, its own chain of authority. The governess was in a well-run household a person of genuine importance. She might be a gentlewoman of reduced fortune, or a woman of the minor nobility who had lost her estate, or a widow who had taken on this role to remain in a position of dignity and responsibility. Whatever her origin, her authority in the nursery was comprehensive. She managed the nurses, the rockers, the laundresses. She supervised the children's eating and sleeping and daily routine. She introduced them to their prayers and their first letters and their table manners, and as children grew beyond infancy, up to approximately the age of 7, which was the accepted threshold of childhood, she was in many respects the most influential adult in their lives. Think about that carefully. The most influential adult in the early lives of the nobility of England was almost universally a woman who is almost never mentioned by name in the history books. The lady mistress of the royal nursery, Elizabeth Lady Darcy, oversaw the upbringing of Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's eldest daughter. Margaret's nurse was Alice Davy, who later went on to serve in the household of Catherine of Aragon. These women moved through the most important domestic transitions of the Tudor dynasty. Their names are preserved in household accounts and wardrobe records almost accidentally in the margins of history's attention, but the children they shaped became queens. Let me bring this forward in time slightly, because the nursery as an institution evolved significantly between the medieval period and the 17th century. By the Tudor era, the great households of England had developed the nursery into an increasingly formalised structure. The lady mistress held significant authority and was paid accordingly. The selection of the wet nurse had become almost a ritual of its own, with careful scrutiny of her health, her character and her moral standing, because the belief that milk transmitted character remained powerful long after the period we might consider medieval. And increasingly, as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, something new began to enter the nursery. Books. Not just prayer books and devotional texts, which had always been present. New books. Books about children, about education, about the principles on which a young mind should be formed. The ideas of Renaissance humanism, the belief that education could shape character, that a well-formed mind was the foundation of a good life filtered down into the nurseries of England with surprising speed. And the women who ran those nurseries read the books. The historian who studies the household libraries of Elizabethan and early Stuart England finds evidence again and again of women who were thinking carefully about how children should be raised, not just replicating what has been done before, but engaging with ideas about language, about nature and nurture, about the relationship between physical health and intellectual development that were current in the most advanced intellectual circles of their time. These women were not passive, they were practitioners, They were implementing a curriculum before the word curriculum existed. Do you know what I find most remarkable about the nursery as a space? It is the only room in the entire history of the castle and manor house that operated on a completely different logic from every other room. Every other space we have visited tonight was defined at least in part by absence. The solar was where you went when you needed to be away from the hall. The bower was behind the solar. The oratory was locked. The closet was private. Even the garden was defined by its walls, by what it kept out. The nursery was defined by presence. It was a room full of people who needed tending, full of small bodies and large noise and the physical demands of new life. There was no question of absence or concealment here. The nursery announced itself. It could not be hidden, and perhaps because of that, because the nursery was the one place in the house where the presence of women and children was unambiguously, unquestionably necessary, it was also the place where women's authority was least challenged. Nobody disputed the governess. Nobody suggested that the management of the nursery should be reviewed or reformed by the men of the household, because the men of the household understood at some level that they may not have been able to articulate that they did not know how to do what was done in that room. Here is a thought I want to leave you with before we move on. Throughout this journey, we've been tracing a single question. Where did women exercise real authority in a world designed to prevent it? We have found it in locked rooms and hidden passages and still room books and garden walls. We have found it in the boudoir of a woman who ran a country from behind closed silk curtains, and in the embroideries of a woman who stitched her political situation into the fabric for anyone to read who knew how to look. But the nursery adds a dimension that none of the other rooms quite capture. All those other spaces were about claiming power in the present. The nursery was about claiming the future. The woman who shaped a child's earliest understanding of the world, its values, its language, its habits of mind, its way of seeing other people, that woman left a mark that no letter burned, no room locked, no diary confiscated could erase. Because the mark was not in a document, the mark was in a person. And those people grew up and made decisions and built things and destroyed other things and passed what had been given to them in the nursery down to their own children in turn. Margaret Beaufort understood this. The lady mistresses of the royal nurseries understood this. The thousands of unnamed governesses across the centuries of English domestic life understood this. And they worked with that understanding in that small warm room every single day. Which brings us, I think, to the question that this whole journey has been building toward. We have travelled from the solar to the bower to the wardrobe, from the oratory with its hidden priests to the still room with its receipt books, from the locked closet where Anne Clifford wrote her legal argument to the boudoir where Madame de Pompadour ran a kingdom, from the spy holes in the walls to the gardens outside and the nursery at the heart of the house. What is the common thread? What do all these spaces share? The answer is not power exactly, not knowledge exactly, not privacy though. All of them involve some form of it. The answer, I think, is something more fundamental. Agency, the capacity to act, to affect the world, to leave a mark that outlasts the moment. And what we're about to discover in the final rooms of tonight's journey is what happened when all of that agency accumulated across centuries in dozens of small hidden spaces finally ran out of walls to contain it. Something extraordinary happened to the drawing room in the 19th century. To understand it, you need to know what the drawing room actually was, and I mean this in the most literal architectural sense. The word itself is a contraction, withdrawing room, the room to which you withdrew. Specifically in the language of the great houses of England from the 17th century onward, it was the room to which the ladies withdrew after dinner, leaving the men at the table with their port and their cigars and their unguarded political opinions. The women went to the drawing room, the men stayed behind, and then the men rejoined the women when they had finished. This is described in every etiquette manual, every household account, every social record of 18th and 19th century English domestic life as the natural order of things. Completely unremarkable. The ladies' room and the gentlemen's room, the drawing room and the dining room separated as clearly as the solar and the great hall had been 6 centuries before. But here is what happened in the 19th century that nobody fully anticipated. The women in the drawing room stopped simply waiting for the men to come back. They had always talked, of course. That is not the revelation. Women in the drawing room talked about their children, their households, their neighbours, their friends, their health. They played the piano. They did their needlework. They received calls in the morning. The morning room, positioned on the ground floor of the Victorian townhouse, was a specifically female space designated for daytime visitors, a formalised version of the bower relocated to a very different architectural and social setting. All of this was expected. All of this was sanctioned. All of this confirmed the idea that the drawing room was a domestic space, a social space, a feminine space, in the most limited and approved meaning of that phrase. What changed in the course of the Victorian period was what the conversations in those rooms began to be about, and then what those conversations produced. I want to start with something that happened in 1865 because it illustrates the mechanism so precisely. A group of women in London had formed a discussion group called the Kensington Society. These were educated middle and upper class women, the kind of women who had access to drawing rooms, who spent their days receiving and making calls, whose lives were structured around exactly the domestic routines we've been tracing throughout this entire journey. In 1865, the Kensington Society began discussing women's suffrage, not protesting, not marching, discussing, in a drawing room. From those discussions, a committee was formed. From the committee, a petition was drafted. The petition gathered 1,499 signatures, and in 1866 it was presented to Parliament by John Stuart Mill, who agreed to deliver it once the women had gathered the 100 signatures he required as proof of serious support. Think about that sequence for a moment. A drawing room conversation became a committee. A committee produced a document reached Parliament, all from women who at that point had no formal political standing whatsoever, no vote, no legal right to be in Parliament, no official role in the governance of the country that the drawing room and its furnishings and its piano were supposed to embody. And yet, before we go any further, I want you to pause and appreciate something about the drawing room as a social space, because I think it is genuinely underrated in the history of political change. The drawing room by the mid-Victorian period had become what we might describe today as a networked meeting space. It was the primary venue through which the social fabric of the middle and upper classes was maintained and reproduced. You made your calls in the drawing room, you received your visitors there. You were introduced to your neighbours' cousins and your husband's colleagues, and the visiting clergyman, and the lady from the next village who also cared passionately about the condition of the local school. In a period without telephones, without email, without any of the communication infrastructure we take for granted, the drawing room was the internet. The flow of information, the formation of relationships, the building of coalitions, all of it happened there over teacups and sheet music and embroidery frames. And the women who presided over those drawing rooms were in the most practical and unglamorous sense the nodes of the network. Every conversation that led to a committee, every connection that led to a petition, every relationship that led to a reform campaign, the path traced back in almost every case to a drawing room. To a woman who had made introductions, facilitated conversations, organised the afternoon's calls with an eye to who needed to meet whom. This is not a metaphor. Historians who have traced the organisational history of Victorian philanthropic and reform movements, the anti-slavery campaigns, the temperance movements, the campaigns for women's education, the suffrage organisations find the drawing room at the centre of nearly every founding story. Let me give you one more very specific example before we talk about the moment when all of this finally broke its container. October 10th, 1903, Manchester, a modest house on Nelson Street, number 62. A small group of women gathered in the drawing room. One of them was Emmeline Pankhurst. The meeting was called out of frustration the suffrage movement had been campaigning through conventional means for decades by this point. Petitions, peaceful meetings, the careful cultivation of political allies, the drawing room discussions, the committee work. All of it had produced some incremental gains, but not the fundamental change they were fighting for. On that October evening in that Manchester drawing room, the Women's Social and Political Union was born. Its motto, which Emmeline Pankhurst declared over the tea that was presumably served, was "Deeds, not words." The drawing room had quite literally run out of patience. What was born in that room that evening would within a decade break completely with everything the drawing room represented as a form of politics. The chaining to railings, the broken windows, the hunger strikes, the death of Emily Wilding Davison at the Epsom Derby in 1913 when she ran in front of the King's horse. These were not drawing room tactics, but they were conceived by women who had been formed in drawing rooms, who had learned the art of political organising, the patient cultivation of allies, the management of a message, the construction of a coalition in exactly the kind of space we have been discussing all night. The drawing room was the school, the street was the examination. I want to step back from the specific history of suffrage for a moment and make a broader observation because I think it gets to the heart of what tonight's journey has been about. Throughout the centuries we've traced from the medieval solar to the Victorian drawing room, there is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Women's authority was first exercised in small rooms, then it expanded into slightly larger rooms, then it crossed the threshold entirely. The solar was private, an upper story invisible from the road. The bower was behind the solar, the closet was locked, but the drawing room faced the street. It had tall windows. It was on the ground floor or the first floor, visible to anyone who passed, and the women in it were receiving visitors from the world, processing information, building relationships, and increasingly, in the 19th century, doing things with that information and those relationships that the architects of the drawing room had never intended. The room was not designed for politics. It was designed to domesticate women's sociability, to contain it within the approved boundaries of household management. But the women who inhabited it took what the room offered the network, the time, the social lubrication of tea and gentility, and used it for something else. There is a line in the historic records of the suffrage campaign that I keep returning to. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the constitutional non-militant wing of the movement, was described by one contemporary historian as conducting a campaign mostly carried out in drawing rooms and at public meetings around the country. Mostly carried out in drawing rooms. That phrase was not meant as a compliment. It was meant to convey the modesty, the respectability, the almost propriety of their methods, in contrast to the Pankhurst's more dramatic tactics. But read it again. The constitutional case for women's right to participate in the governance of their country was being built, organised and sustained in drawing rooms by women who sat in those rooms every day, who understood exactly what the rooms were supposed to mean and chose to mean something else in them. I find that extraordinary. Not because it is surprising that women were strategic. We have established that they were across centuries and across every room in this building. But because of the specific act of turning the drawing room, the most conspicuously domestic space, the room literally named for female withdrawal, into the engine of a campaign for political presence. The withdrawal room became the advance room. Now I want to make a connection that I think is deeper than it might first appear. We have spent this entire journey tracing the arc of women's agency from the solar to the present moment. And what strikes me standing at the end of that arc and looking back is something about the relationship between concealment and visibility. The early rooms were hidden. The bower was behind the solar. The oratory was locked. The closet was at the end of the corridor. The wardrobe was for robes that nobody was watching you wear. All that hidden knowledge, all those hidden conversations, all those spaces where women thought and planned and acted, they were effective precisely because they were invisible. But there is a cost to invisibility. The cost is that the power it generates is essentially private. It changes individual outcomes, specific negotiations, particular children. It shapes the world in the way that water shapes stone slowly from the inside, in ways that are hard to trace and harder to credit. The drawing room was something different. It was visible. Calling cards were left. Visitors were received. Accounts were kept of who came and who was turned away. The drawing room left a paper trail, a social record, a history. And the campaigns that were organised in drawing rooms, the petitions, the committees, the societies, the unions, those left records too. Records that historians could find. Records that told a story that could be told publicly. This is, I think, the single most important transition in the history of women's spaces. Not the moment when the suffragettes chained themselves to railings. Before that. Much before that. The moment when the conversations in the private room moved out into the world and generated documentation. That is the moment when hidden power became visible power, and visible power can be fought for, and visible power can be won. Does any of this feel familiar? I want to ask you that directly, because what I keep thinking about sitting with all of this history is how much of it is still true. The insight that informal networks are as powerful as formal institutions. The understanding that the room where the conversation happens before the meeting shapes the meeting. The knowledge that information management is power, and that those who control the flow of information in a social network have an influence that no official title quite captures. None of these insights were discovered in the 20th century. They were practiced, refined, and transmitted across the centuries we have spent together tonight. In small rooms, behind locked doors, in gardens and nurseries and drawing rooms and all the other spaces that history described as merely domestic. There is one more room we have not visited, and I want to spend our final chapter there because I think it is the room that ties everything else together, not as a space of concealment or a space of strategy, but as something quieter and in some ways more extraordinary. A room that all the women we have met tonight were working toward without perhaps knowing it. A room that is in its way the answer to the question that has been running through this entire journey. What is the final destination of all that hidden work? What happens when the rooms run out? What is left when there is nothing more to conceal and nowhere left to hide? The answer, I think, is simpler and more beautiful than any of the rooms that preceded it. Stay with me. And so we come to the last room. The one Virginia Woolf described in 1929 in an essay that began as 2 lectures delivered to female students at the women's colleges of Cambridge, University, Newnham and Girton, 2 institutions that themselves had only existed for about 50 years at the time. She stood before those women in the autumn of 1928, and she said something so clear and so simple that it has never quite stopped echoing. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she's to write fiction. 1 sentence, 9 words. The entire history of tonight's journey compressed into a single statement, so obvious, so basic, so apparently reasonable, that its very simplicity reveals just how long the answer had been denied. But here is what I want you to notice now that we have travelled all the way from the solar to this final chapter. When Woolf said, "a room of one's own," she was not describing something new. She was finally publicly in language that the world could read and preserve and quote, naming something that women had been doing for 800 years. The solar was a room of one's own. Imperfect, shared with a husband, not entirely private, but an attempt. a beginning. The bower was a room of one's own, more private, genuinely theirs. The wardrobe, the oratory, the still room, the closet, the boudoir, each one a variant of the same thing, a space, a door that could be closed, a context in which it was possible to be just for a moment simply a person rather than a function. And the drawing room, that enormous, visible, socially sanctioned room, was the final evolution of a sequence that began in the locked closet and ended somewhere much larger, much more public, and ultimately much more powerful. Woolf was not inventing an idea. She was delivering a verdict. 8 centuries of evidence compressed into a sentence. Let me tell you something about the drawing room that I find genuinely wonderful in a slightly ironic way. The word drawing room is, as we established, a contraction, drawing from withdrawing, the room to which you withdrew. In 1465, an architectural plan for a great English house referred to the withdrawing room as the space where the lady of the house could withdraw from the great hall for privacy. In 1865, exactly 400 years later, women were meeting in drawing rooms to draft the first petition to Parliament demanding the right to vote. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and a small group of women gathered in a drawing room on Nelson Street in Manchester to found the organisation that would spend the next decade changing the constitutional framework of the country they lived in. The room that began as a place of withdrawal had become over 4 centuries a place of advance. That is not a metaphor. That is architecture adapting to the people who inhabit it across time. And it happened in exactly the same way that everything else we have traced tonight happened, not with proclamations and formal grants of power, but with the quiet, patient, persistent work of women who understood that the room they were in could be used for something the room was never designed for. I've been thinking throughout this entire journey about a particular kind of courage, not the courage of the battlefield, which is real and demands respect, not the courage of the public declaration, the speech, the march. Both of those have their place, but the particular kind of courage that it takes to do something invisible, to build something that will not be credited to you, to work in a room that the world has decided is not important, and to know quietly and with complete certainty that what you are doing matters. The women we have met tonight had that kind of courage in extraordinary supply. Anne Vaux standing in a doorway at 5 a.m, buying time with composure, while men with weapons searched her house and priests stood in cold water underground. She was not credited for this in any official record. She was not called brave. She was called a hot holy lady by her enemies, which is actually rather wonderful. Hildegard of Bingen writing down centuries of accumulated plant knowledge in a monastery garden in the 12th century, in a book that was lost and found and lost again, and finally recovered in the 20th century, so that 800 years after she put the words down, scientists analysed her work and concluded that she had not made it up. Anne Clifford keeping her diary for 70 years in a room that could be locked, writing her legal argument document by document, refusing every settlement, waiting decades for the inheritance that was rightfully hers. The unnamed governess in the nursery of a medieval castle, teaching a child to read prayers in a language that would shape the child's understanding of the world for the rest of their life. The still-room maid copying recipes into a book that would be bequeathed to her daughter and amended and improved and bequeathed again for generations, until the book was so full of hands and voices that it had ceased to belong to any single person and had become something else, a collective record, a community memory, an act of care extended across time. What strikes me now, having spent all this time inside these rooms, is how wrong the popular image of medieval and early modern women actually is. We tend to picture them as passive, confined, waiting, the damsel in the tower, the dutiful wife at the dinner table, the decorative figure in the solar window. But every room we have visited tonight says something different. The woman in the solar was not waiting. She was managing the information landscape of a complex household. The woman in the bower was not embroidering passively. She was authoring herself in the only language available to her. The woman in the oratory was not merely praying. She was running an underground network that kept a religious tradition alive through persecution. The woman in the still room was not cooking. She was practicing science. The woman in the closet was not sulking. She was writing a legal brief that she would hold on to for 40 years until the world finally caught up with her. The woman in the boudoir was not receiving visitors. She was running a country. The woman in the nursery was not raising a child. She was deciding the future. The woman in the garden was not gardening. She was making a declaration. The woman in the drawing room was not serving tea. She was drafting a petition. Every room had an official purpose and a real one, and the official purpose and the real one were never quite the same. Here is the last thought I want to leave you with. You live in a room of your own right now. Not a medieval solar, not a 16th century closet, something much more literal and much less dramatic. A bedroom, a study, a corner of an apartment, whatever private space you have claimed as yours in whatever building you inhabit. And that room, however modest, however temporary, however unlike Hardwicke Hall or Versailles, or the grand houses of the Tudor nobility, exists because of the long, quiet, cumulative work of every woman who fought for one before you. Not fought dramatically, most of them. Not with weapons or public speeches, but with locked doors, with careful observation through holes in walls, with receipt books and diary entries and embroidery patterns and garden designs and drawing room petitions, with the knowledge persistent and unextinguishable that what happened in private spaces mattered, that the work done in rooms that nobody was watching was still absolutely and without question work. Virginia Woolf said a woman must have a room of her own if she is to write fiction. But what tonight's journey has shown us is something older, and I think more fundamental than even that. A woman must have a room of her own to think in, to grieve in, to plan in, to practice medicine in, to pray in when prayer is dangerous, to keep accounts in, to make embroidery that carries messages that no one is supposed to read, to raise children who will grow up to change things. The room was never just a room. It was always also a world. And with that, with all of those rooms laid out behind us from the solar above the medieval Great Hall to the drawing room that produced the petition that changed a nation, we've come to the end of tonight's journey. We started in the dark with a world so public that a noblewoman could barely take a breath without someone watching. We end here in the quiet of a room that is yours. And if anything in tonight's story has stayed with you, one of those women, one of those rooms, one of those moments when something small and private became something lasting, then I would love to know which one. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. Tell me which room surprised you most. Tell me which woman you want to know more about. Tell me if you thought about your own space differently, even for a moment. Because this conversation is one of the reasons I do this. Not just to share history, but to find out what in that history lands, what resonates across the centuries into whatever room you are in right now. If you made it all the way here, all the way from the Great Hall to this final thought, then honestly thank you. From the bottom of my heart. You gave me your evening, you gave me your quiet, you trusted me with your sleepy hours, and I hope I gave you something worth dreaming about. There are more rooms, of course, more stories, more women who carved out spaces in worlds that tried to contain them, and more secrets hidden in the architecture of places that most of us will only ever see from the outside. The next story is already waiting, and I promise it is worth staying for. Good night.